What is going on, Higherside Chatters? Drinking a little drink, smoking a little smoke from sunny San Diego. I'm your humble host, Greg Carlwood, and I think we all love to look at popular culture and try to extrapolate the true meaning in these products of the Hollywood propaganda machine, because we've been at this long enough to know there's more happening here than harmless entertainment, but to what degree and to what end? Are we being groomed to subconsciously accept our enslavement and the incoming agendas of the global elite? Are the breadcrumbs that lead to the discovery of a true secret space program in the transhumanist agenda being left peppered throughout sci-fi and spy thriller films? I don't know. They're curious questions, but it does take a truly dedicated mind to separate the wheat from the chaff in this realm of Hollywood breakdowns, and luckily we have just such a guest to help us navigate this vast sea of secrets emanating from the silver screen. His name is Jay Dyer, and he has a Bachelor's of the Arts in Philosophy, as well as being the man behind jaysanalysis.com, where he unpacks the dense details of many of the big films and media we see them churning out. You can see him take the stage at the Secret Space Program Conference in Austin, Texas at the end of the month, and I'm really psyched he's here today. Jay, my man, how the hell are you?
I'm doing rockin' awesome, man.
That's cool. We're really excited that you're here. I mean, you do great work. It seems like so many blogs and websites have been cropping up in recent years trying to do these types of breakdowns of symbols and subtext of major films, but you definitely seem to cut to more the core and parse out more meaning than most, I would say.
Thank you.
You know, no problem, man. And I guess to start this thing, where did you start looking at films as more than just entertainment?
Grew up loving movies. Family promoted the arts. My mom was majored in English when she was in college, and she was an editor for a long time. So I just grew up in the realm of books and lit. And then we've all, in America at least, pretty much been saturated with Hollywood. We've grown up with movies. So I grew up with all the classics of 80s science fiction, E.T. and all that, and Star Wars. So then by the time I reached undergrad, I decided that I wanted to do philosophy. And of course, a lot of philosophy courses will get you to ask all kinds of out-of-the-box questions, which I've always enjoyed doing. That's always just kind of been the dude I am. And by the time I got to grad school, you have a lot more freedom with what you can choose to study and research. So I had the option of choosing grad work in English and philosophy, which allowed me to integrate film as well as geopolitics, because I'd done my undergraduate is also in history. So I was able to take a lot of historical research and just tie it all in together. And that's always what I've been interested in doing with these subjects, is approaching them as a integrative thinker rather than some sort of boring specialist who just stares at earthworms all day, like those in scientism in that realm. So what I like to do is, I like the idea of a Renaissance man. I don't necessarily think that I am one, but we've lost that idea from the Middle Ages of late Middle Ages of that kind of guy or person or thinker or artist or whatever who can integrate multiple areas of thought, art, history, etc. So that's what I did. I said, all right, well, what's something interesting I can write about? And concurrent with this, I had the website going for most of undergrad and grad years. I had an old blog that I got rid of, started a new one about 5 years ago. And that's what you currently see in its present incarnation as jaysanalysis.com. And started with the movie stuff. And I started doing it before other certain sites out there that do it. And I like that you caught that I try to take it in a little more academic, a little more serious, a little deeper approach than the other sort of watered down, more tabloidy sites. Although I don't mind being a little tabloidy here and there, it gets readers,
Right.
So that's what happened. I started working on a master's thesis that was dealt with James Bond and Ian Fleming, and how Ian Fleming basically wrote into all the stories, all the novels, real world black operations and Psy-Ops type stuff, because he was a high level naval Psy-Ops officer, which most people don't know that. And then when you find that out about Ian Fleming, you say, oh, well, that actually makes a lot more sense with what's going on in the Bond novels as well as the films too, I should add.
Right.
So I just thought that would be a great topic for graduate level research. And this is kind of trendy in academia now, because a lot of people don't read the academic papers that are produced. They just kind of go into a vault in the basement of your university, and they just sit there. So people are kind of gotten into this trend of trying to be a little more relevant, culturally relevant. And we're just so saturated with pop culture that this is now kind of a norm in academia where people are analyzing these kinds of things. And I wasn't averse to that. I thought it would be kind of cool. So I wanted to choose something that could tie in philosophy and psychological warfare and history, military operations, and fiction and pop culture. And what better to do than James Bond?
Yeah, I think the James Bond information is super interesting. The Ian Fleming stuff, the fact that he was a British naval Psy-Ops officer.
Right.
I guess a question for you is, what would be some of his objectives in writing the Bond series? What does he get out of, not necessarily him, but what does the larger elite community get out of predictive programming and leaving these kinds of breadcrumbs?
Well, I think if you look at the time setting when he was beginning to do his work, this is at the close of World War II, and Fleming was involved in different operations like Operation Mincemeat and the operation that involved the Enigma machine with Alan Turing and all that, cracking that code. So Fleming was kind of floating around in the background, a lot of that stuff. And in certain operations, he was directly involved in planning and trying to lure, say, Rudolf Hess into Scotland through the use of Aleister Crowley. So that was kind of, Fleming was in the background with that. He was in the background with other staged situations in military operations where you would have a fake body laid out with disinformation plans laid in the jacket of the soldier for the Germans to find. So when the Germans found the soldier, they were then given disinformation. This was all hatched in Ian Fleming's mind, along with his other British PSYOP buddies. And many of the people in those sort of wealthy classed lesser nobility circles and nobility circles that Fleming was involved with were actually involved in pretty hardcore esoteric stuff, magic and so forth. So Maxwell Knight, for example, is a famous British intelligence agent. And some people think he's the basis for either Bond himself in part or the character M in the novel, who's Bond's handler. But there are, I think the reality is that after you read about 10 or 15 books on this subject, you start realizing that what Ian Fleming did was probably just combine, a whole bunch of characters into the person of Bond. So even perhaps older era British Renaissance spies factor into it, like John Dee, or even Ian Fleming himself factors into it, Maxwell Knight. All of these people sort of have a role in that. So on one level, excuse me, I was at a concert this weekend, so I'm kind of recuperating. You can hear that in my voice, but
no worries.
So on one level, it was NSYNC. I was at the NSYNC concert dancing all weekend. Okay, not really. But so on one level, Fleming is writing fiction and he's having fun with it. It was initially just considered pulp dime store novel stuff. And then over time, the scholar Umberto Eco, who's a famous Italian semiotician and author, wrote a piece that sort of raised the status of, it's called Narrative Structure in Ian Fleming's Bond, I believe is the title of it. So he wrote that famous essay in the 60s, and that kind of catapulted Fleming into a little more literary a little more respected literary status than he previously had. Mm-hmm. So when that happened, they started, I think, realizing that, actually a lot could be done. Now, Hollywood and theater had for a long time been used for propaganda, psychological warfare, all the way back to things like Virgil's Aeneid. That was Roman state propaganda. But with the rise of modern advertising and the Bond stories are actually kind of instrumental in some of the earliest versions of product placement. Sean Connery had a famous interview that he gave at Playboy back in the 60s, where after he'd done a couple Bond films, he was saying, we're actually experimenting with placing vodka in the films. So shaken, not stirred. And that was associated with vodka. And then, so they started realizing that they could, promote, advertise. So another level of it is, of course, product placement.
Right.
The next level of it would be, propaganda. So you could have what's called in the form of this in Psy-Ops could be something like projection, where what your side is doing, you would actually project onto the enemy, right? So the fictional organization of Spectre, Special Executive for Counterintelligence, SPECT, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. I had to think for a minute. That's what Spectre stands for. This actually comes from the first incarnation in Casino Royale, which is called SMERSH, which has a similar acronym. And SMERSH is actually Soviet intelligence. That was actually a real world Soviet intelligence operation. And you can read about that there's an article at my site that an excellent Russian translator named Nina did, and it's called Hitler's Plot to Assassinate Stalin. And you'll read about the real world basis for SMERSH there, Soviet military counterintelligence under Grigory Grigorenko. But so from SMERSH, though, after a little, it quickly turns into Spectre in the novels. And so what Spectre is this international criminal syndicate that is not bound by any national ties and basically recruits the best spies and assassins, and is pretty much a private mafia type cartel,
right.
Secret society organization, right?
Sounds familiar.
Exactly. And so what's going on here is that pretty much since the British establishment, more or less, the Royal Society and so forth, is who is Spectre? Well, then what would you do? Well, you would say that Russia is Spectre, right? And so you tack it onto some nation state. Well, the Nazi Germany is Spectre, when it's actually the Royal Society, and that's the real Spectre. So that's called projection, right? So if you're engaged in biowarfare programs, vaccination programs, mass inoculation programs, depopulation, all these things that are projected onto villains like Blofeld, these are explicitly stated as plans by the Royal Society. So that's another level of it. Now, to what degree Fleming was actually cognizant of that, it's hard to parcel out. I've looked at the collection of Ian Fleming's personal library. He did have quite a few pretty deep state, esoteric, dark titles there, a handful of them. And he was very much connected to the establishment. He actually helped Bill Donovan set up the OSS. He was one of the British intelligence agents that helped the OSS come about in the U.S., our first so-called intelligence agency, with Bill Donovan. So you can see that he's very much a mover and shaker. He's palling around with Aristotle Onassis and different nobility. He comes from a prominent, wealthy banking family, the Valentine banking family. So Valentine Fleming, I should say, was a prominent banker as well as his granddad. So he's not coming from the outskirts. He's not a low level person who is just kind of working his way up. He's very much tied into the intelligence establishment of the globe and palling around with the elites.
Yeah.
So that would lead me to think that he probably had a really good insight into what was going on in the world. And so that's the propaganda element of it. The psyop element of it, in short, is the projection element of it. You put onto the enemy what you're actually doing. And I don't mean to oversimplify things. It's not like it's just a world of good guy, bad guy. But that's how it functions in propaganda.
Right. Yeah, it's a real curious thing to me. I guess another thing people sometimes say is that a purpose it serves is when something actually does happen, say vaccines, for example, when people are talking about a real world vaccine issue, someone will say, what are you talking about, man? That's just the plot from Kingsman. I guess it makes it easier for people to dismiss if they've seen it in a movie previously, as it's not possibly a real world thing. Is that an element?
It is. It's a conditioning element in terms of social engineering. And I believe that this is my thesis on that aspect of it, is that especially when you look at science fiction, if you look at somebody like Asimov, and so when he was sketching out the Foundation series back in the 40s, and it was published in like Amazing Stories or whatever, and then it became a novel soon after that. If you read the Foundation, what it discusses is this future galactic empire where everything is run on the basis of predictive algorithms. And so the main character, Hari Seldon, is a scientist who develops this algorithm that is somehow what it does is it looks at mass movements for a long time, and then based on pattern recognition projects into the future, most likely scenarios. And so he can actually predict the downfalls of empires with it. Now, this is actually the Google Palantir type technology that we see revealed today by the NSA and these different, tech giant corporations, Google, Apple, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so what's the use of this in terms of fiction and science fiction? Well, so if you could project what would be going on back in the 40s and 50s, like Asimov, and then decades later, this comes to be, well, you've kind of almost prophesied in a way, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying that like they literally were prophesying, like speaking to the Oracle at Delphi or something. Right. But what I'm saying is that it gives the impression to the public that, oh man, like they're the new gods, the new priest class. That's what I'm getting at. So what you do is you suppress the technology and the secrets that you've discovered in nature and the hidden tech and all that. You give everybody kind of a bogus, materialistic kind of philosophy. This is my view. And then as you release these tech secrets out into the world in a very controlled way, because we live under like a planned obsolescence system. It's not a free market cutting edge type system.
I agree with that.
You gradually leak out something that you probably discovered the basics for, 50 years ago. And then what that does is give you the impression of this godlike status. And that's actually revealed in the Foundation series. They actually reveal the secrets of technology under the guise of a religion. And Asimov makes that abundantly clear in the first novel. So that's a great example of that. And you can see that with H.G. Wells too, things to come, these different projections of the future that he had that seem to line up pretty accurately to where we're going. So yes, it's a conditioning, it's a psy-op, it's propaganda, it's advertising. It gives you a godlike status because it looks like you're telling the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a very multifaceted agenda. And so at this upcoming conference, I guess you're speaking on the theme of predictive programming, Hollywood, and the notion of a breakaway civilization. And on your blog, you wrote a piece about the James Bond movie Moonraker. Can you walk us through why Moonraker is a good example for this topic?
I can. It's ridiculous and it's campy. It's cheeseball. It's one of my least favorite Bond stories. Very different from the novel, but I still think we can come away from the movie with a good insight into what's really going on. Because that's kind of like some of these novels were written, like that was written in 1950. What was the year? I forget the year of Moonraker being written, 55. Okay, so this is written in 1955, and it's actually about the V2 rocket program in the novel. So this is Operation Paperclip. So there's Sir Hugo Drax in the novel is running this secret space program that's private. And under the guise of protecting London with a big ICBM, he's actually going to nuke London because he's in his heart of hearts, he's still a member of the SS, or he's a secret Nazi, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the novel plot, and that's more or less accurate in terms of what happened with the Operation Paperclip and the secret space program in terms of what the history of NASA and all that. So I'm sure everybody's got some general sense of that if you've ever been in the conspiracy world. But what's interesting about the film incarnation is that 1979, kind of riding on the cusp of Star Wars and in 2001, these big sci-fi blockbusters that had emerged. I think the directors and producers thought that it would be a good idea to try to put Bond in space. So Spies in Space, which doesn't tend to work out very well. So it's a cheeseball movie, but yeah, I guess it had some pretty big special effects for the time. But even in some of these campy cheeseball things, we can actually find at times pretty deep revelations of, predictive programming or whatever terms you want to use. And so in this scenario, we have this secret space program that's actually run by a private guy mega billionaire. We can think about Elon Musk. We can think about SpaceX, or these different real world incarnations that we see of this kind of thing now. And this is like a DARPA style space-based weapon system that is interlinked to the satellite system. So we can think of Skynet here. I've linked many times. I've got another piece called Skynet is Real. And it's the subtitle is Alchemists, Exemplarism, and Technosis. And I cite some actual Pentagon documents about the plan for Skynet. Now, this is public. It's not hidden. You can find the documents at FAS.org, Federation of American Scientists, which is pretty much an academic open source database for these kinds of white papers. And so under the guise of the Cold War, you have the erection of this private space program, and that's what we see in Moonraker. And so the scenario is more or less that this secretive organization, it's always the same. Although it's not Spectre in Moonraker, it might as well be. It's just another private person, a secret shadow guy who's erecting and putting the money into this DARPA, Star Wars Defense Initiative style weaponization of space through the satellite systems. Mm-hmm. And so ultimately it's going to be interlinked globally, an Internet of Things scenario. And what's really fascinating, though, is actually based on what you see in the film, is that it's actually based on the real historical ideas of breakaway civilizations, right? So if we think about, for example, the Nazi perspective on Germanic peoples having a biological supremacist status, the Nazis were a kind of breakaway civilization. If we think about Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand is presenting another version of the breakaway civilization there, where John Galt's hidden away secret community of elites and true libertarians is, behind this holographic mountain out in Colorado while they let the rest of the world go to shit, right?
Yeah.
It's the same scenario here, right? So and it's called in the film, Roger Moore says, well, it's Noah's Ark. So they're actually going to reseed the earth with, Hugo Drax wants to reseed the earth with his progeny. And that will make him kind of like a new Adam, a new God, a new creator. And so it's a new Genesis. And meanwhile, he's going to get rid of the rest of the population through aerosol spraying of a bioweapon.
Boom.
Yeah. So that's the secret that Bond discovers. Bond discovers that Drax Industries has a front corporation called Vinny Glass, and the glass company is actually manufacturing a bioweapon that will be sprayed on the planet. So there we have, you think about Bill Gates, right? You got aerosolized geoengineering, DNA manipulation, vaccinations, alteration of the genome, Monsanto, seed vaults, right? So right. This is kind of portrayed here in this 1979 Bond camp film, which is quite astonishing, I think, in my view. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty deep. And in your analysis, you say that the book is kind of phase 1 of Project Paperclip, and then the movie is kind of phase 2. And you mentioned that this phase 2 of the operation, the plugging in of Nazi scientists to the American machine, is responsible for the UFO Foo Fighters we see today. Do you think all of these exotic crafts are man-made?
I'm of the opinion that what happens is, so you have this idea that UFOs are like ancient visitors, or like the visitations of the gods or something like that. Now, I do think that it's possible that you can reverse engineer secret technology. I don't think that it comes directly from like the Space Brothers or something. What I think is that you have in the ancient rituals and myths that may have an origin in these gods. You can actually tease out technological secrets. So I do think there is some truth to that paleotechnology aspect. And that's why we see, as I've said many times in discussions, if you look at Plato's dialogues, how does Plato know what's going on at the atomic level? How does he know the structure of reality is actually Platonic solids, geometric forms? Mm-hmm. How does Socrates in the Phaedo know that there are colors outside of our color spectrum and that there are actually higher dimensions, which he actually says? Well, how does he know this now, given the fact that now there's electron microscopes that can look at the subatomic level, and this is what we see? So there had to be some source, some transmission of knowledge in that ancient time period that went beyond what we tend to consider as just simplistic, ancient, superstitious man, right?
Right.
And Plato says in the Timaeus that this comes from Egypt. It's the Egyptian tradition. So I'm of the opinion that that's the origin of some of these tech secrets. And when you start looking into hidden metaphysics, deep technology, that kind of stuff, there does seem to be a parallel to what you read in ancient myths. Mm-hmm. I don't have a perfect explanation for how that. I don't know how that is, but it looks to be the case.
Right.
But I don't think that what we see most of the time in modern pop culture and in terms of UFO experience and phenomena is like extraterrestrial beings. I tend to think that it's a terrestrial phenomena. It is largely a psy-op. I do think there's an occult esoteric aspect to it. I do think it does apply to, at times, there's a possibility of the higher angelic entities being involved in this. Mm-hmm. But I don't generally accept like the ET style mythology of it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I grew up enjoying that alien motif, but in later years, I do see several flaws with it along the way. But it is a curious thing. I like the idea that these technological secrets could come from some of these occult rituals of the elite, that might really be what's behind it. Right. Because we see technology and magic, they seem to connect pretty well, especially when you look at the things that NASA puts out or even CERN. They seem to have, callbacks to occult symbolism, and it's very strange because in the mainstream, we're kind of told that these are diametrically opposed views. They're either a foo-foo magic person or you're a hardcore scientist. So yes. I think it's really funny that behind the scenes we see this interlocking. And yeah, I'm a big fan of that perspective that they might be communicating with something, some multidimensional entity, some type of spiritual entity that isn't necessarily a gray from Zeta Reticuli, but yes. They're getting some type of information that is valuable for them. Otherwise, why would they waste their time with the rituals?
Bingo. You got it. That's exactly it. It's also possible that most people don't have any conception of this, but what if the scientific action or what you're enacting in a lab, what if it is itself a ritual?
That's true.
In other words, what if what's happening at CERN is a ritual? And if you look at CERN's website recently, they have this video of all these dancers putting on this performance.
Yes.
And there's they're all wearing the Masonic square and compass, right? So it is a ritual, right? Mm-hmm. And I have a bunch of pieces that treat this as well. And I think that's why you can go back to even people like John Dee. I have an essay I wrote called John Dee, Leibniz, John Dee, and Golems, or something to that effect. I wrote it a couple of years ago. But I go into some of John Dee's writings and I compare him to Leibniz's writings. And being roughly contemporary, they both projected on the basis of their philosophy that you could create. There's the old golem mythology, and that's what AI is, more or less. And Leibniz was able to figure out from what he could project based on his Platonic philosophy that you could create a mirror machine that worked on the principles of the human mind. So basically, you could create a computer, and that's why Leibniz would later go on to be instrumental in the formation of the computer. It's also worth mentioning that Newton was a big-time alchemist. And so what Newton did was he would actually read the ancient myths, in an alchemical way. And he would do his experiments based on the mythological and alchemical recipes that he could find in the myths. And that's, most people don't know that, but that's 100% true. And last I read at least, all of Newton's alchemical writings are actually stored in Tel Aviv. So Newton is part of this kind of Royal Society secret esoteric metaphysical group. You look at Leibniz and what he was doing in Germany, and some of these Vienna Circle people kind of had the same thing going on there. So we can't look at science as what it's presented as either, because there's a lot more going on. But I like that you mentioned the ritual aspect of the sort of advanced and secret technology, because you can see this clearly if you go to CERN's website in terms of lectures. I have an article I wrote. The one that I titled "We Platonists Will Have the Victory," or it's titled "Energetic Ether Metaphysics." Both of those are worth reading, but one of the two I include Arthur Miller's lecture, and Arthur Miller is a scholar of Wolfgang Pauli, who was a famous quantum physicist of the 20th century, almost as big as Einstein. But Pauli was also into Platonism and the esoteric. He wrote a whole treatise on Johann Kepler and alchemy and Kepler. But Pauli said, just like Werner Heisenberg, that at the lowest level of reality, what we see is Platonic geometric forms. We see formal structure. At the lowest level, the fabric of reality is highly designed and organized. It's not random chaos like the Darwinians say. So there you have it. And Arthur Miller points out all this esoteric stuff. And so there you go right there. That's directly at CERN. And Arthur Miller has a famous book on Pauli. Out of an Archetype is another good book on Pauli you can look at. Where the modern cutting edge science type guys are into this kind of stuff. Now, I am also of the opinion that some of this quantum consciousness stuff is a lot of BS too. So you can't just go by this quantum consciousness stuff either, because sometimes that's disinformation and baloney as well. So the truth is always generally somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love this kind of stuff. And I guess another element that kind of ties in is, to quote your blog, you say that you believe the celestial intelligences organize the synchronicities, the synchronicitous events and connections we experience under the power and guidance of God. And this is an interesting paradigm. Are you saying that when we experience synchronicities, that might be what's behind this? This is some type of maybe communication?
Yeah, I believe it's a script. I believe it's angelic script. And that actually goes back to the ancient Eastern notion, right? So the Hindu notion of what they call Sandhabhayasa was the idea that in modern philosophy, it's called semiotics. In ancient religious philosophy, it's that. And it's this idea that scripts can be written not just by humans in terms of, parchment paper or vellum or whatever, but that if we're ruled by celestial intelligences, and this is the normative perspective, the normative metaphysical view of how the world's made up, the universe is made up, in the Middle Ages and ancient world, well, the celestial intelligences are intelligences, right? So they're not just inert, immaterial, impersonal forces. They're actual intelligent beings, and they exist in kind of a graded hierarchy, what the Western religious tradition has called the celestial hierarchy. And you find that even in the Western Hermetic tradition as well as the Western theological tradition. So you can even look at somebody like Cornelius Agrippa and his 3 books of occult philosophy. He goes into great depth discussing the celestial hierarchy. So you would have angels, cherubim, seraphim, dominions, principalities, powers, and so forth. These are all sort of graded into 9 choirs of these beings. But there's also a corresponding fallen hierarchy from every one of these ranks as well. And that would, of course, make up the power forces that would be, Lucifer and Satan and so forth and all that. So I tend to think that those perspectives on how the world operates are much more accurate. And so you can get really, really deep and intensive into this kind of research, and you find out that actually certain numbers correspond with certain spirits and so forth, and these are old ideas, of course, but I think they're more accurate than what we're given as baloney science since Darwin and Newton. Ultimately, unfortunately, Newton has more bad ideas, I think, than good ideas in my view.
Yeah.
Leibniz is somebody much better in that time period. But I also tend to favor a lot of sort of the Eastern Orthodox theologians' perspectives on these as well. I think they have tremendous insights that most Western minds are not cued into, generally speaking. So if you read someone like Gregory of Nyssa, he has really, really in-depth, elaborate treatments of all this. He goes into the nature of infinity, really, really in-depth, which, most people were not even conceiving of that until modern mathematics with people like Georg Cantor. But you can find precedents for that kind of thought all the way back to Gregory of Nyssa. But anyway, so you look at these Eastern theologians, and there's a famous book, Dionysios, and Dionysios has a treatise that's easily searchable. It's not that long, called The Celestial Hierarchy. And it's really good to get a perspective on this. And so if we want to look at the UFO alien type phenomena. I think it really fits into that matrix, that paradigm of understanding a lot better than in terms of the Darwinian ethos of, and this is generally the reason for why we're supposed to believe in aliens in terms of the, ET sense, is because we're told that, because the universe is, gazillions of years old, then that stands to reason that there would be life that evolved on other planets. And because it's gazillions of years old, those other planets would have beings with much more insight and wisdom than us. And so they would be able to fly here across the galaxy. But of course, they run out of gas or something and their ship crashes, which doesn't make much sense to me. Like if you can fly across the galaxy, but your ship crashes like a weather balloon or like something, like over in the desert, right? But
right. That's one of those issues.
But so a better paradigm, I believe, than that Darwinian ethos, and that's actually what the Royal Society has always promoted, is the idea of aliens and panspermia. A better perspective, I think, is the biblical account of the fallen hierarchy of angels and the Nephilim and the Watchers and all that, which I do think that's what Genesis 6 is talking about, if we're honest with that text.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to accept that synchronicities are angelic scripts, I mean, that's an interesting thought, but I guess from that paradigm, what should we glean? What insight should we get from synchronicities? Does that mean that we're on some type of proper path for our true will, or?
Well, I'll give you that's a great question. Okay. So now I'm not saying this is like applicable to everyone, but for example, if you read the book of Daniel, in some of the texts, there's a Hebrew word that's used where the angel that comes to visit Daniel is in the Hebrew is called Palmoni, and that means in the Hebrew the wonderful numberer. So he's the angel who's in some way associated with numbers, times, calendars, and dates. Now, I'm not being John Hagee or Hal Lindsey here. I think that's all bullshit. Mm-hmm. But I do think that that's what the text of Daniel is talking about, and what what the angel tells to Daniel, the wonderful numberer, says that, I'm here to give you wisdom and insight on these topics. And so you're going to understand, and he tells Daniel, based on what you read in the other prophets, the patterns of what happens in history. Now, I believe that there are these kinds of patterns that emerge in history. And even secular, non-religious philosophers and historians have come to similar notions, like Oswald Spengler in Decline of the West, where he, in a kind of a Daniel type way, looks at history. And that's why, so Daniel, when he looks at the world empires, if you've read the book or if you recall it, he sees this big idol, and the idol has clay, stone, brass, gold that make it up. And these represent 4 successive world empires or civilizations. Mm-hmm. And so what Daniel's able to do is, because he's given wisdom, insight, and knowledge, he's actually able to read that sort of angelic pattern script in history. And that is how Daniel understands times, dates, and seasons, and is able to prophesy quite a bit. So that's what it is. So in other words, what the biblical historical account of the office of the prophet is the person who's able to understand those aspects through the wisdom that God grants. We see that as well with Ezekiel. There's a lot of similarities between Ezekiel, Daniel, and John's Apocalypse, for example, as well as the book of Zechariah. So these are all biblical prophetic texts that I think speak to this, to how it's possible that history and events can be scripted by angelic powers. And now how all that works, I don't know. I'm not some kind of expert. I'm not saying I'm a prophet either, but that would be my analysis of it. And I also think that, you can have, because there is a spiritual battle that's going on in the spiritual realm that's kind of mirrored on our level of reality in the material realm. You can have different powers engaging in different operations, right? So not all events are necessarily ordered by good powers. You can have wicked powers that perhaps are invoked or engaged in or interacted with in some way, ritually or I don't know, whatever, that organize ritual events to set forth a kind of discharge into the psychosphere, so to speak.
Man, it's a deep and interesting thread for sure. To bring it back to movies a little bit, talk to us about Interstellar, because if there's going to be movies that allude to things going on in a secret space program, this would certainly have to be one of them, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, it's a more recent incarnation of this theme of the secret space program. So I think to start, Interstellar is Christopher Nolan's homage to 2001, right? So it's very much based on 2001, but he changes up where it goes a little bit. So it's not exactly like 2001. And it's also worth noting that I think Christopher Nolan films, as I've said many times, are important to pay attention to because Christopher Nolan films are full of predictive programming. So we've all, I think, in conspiracy world now could become familiar with the Batman Sandy Hook reference, right?
Right.
So, how that was put there, who put that there, it's hard to say. I understand that there was like a production company that was involved in producing the props and so forth. And so, to me, I would say that looks to be intentional. And given the fact that so much of what Nolan deals with in his films, all the way back even to Memento or Insomnia, is dealing with archetypes. And that's, Jungian. And so Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli had a long correspondence which is very much worth reading. If you get Carl Jung's book on synchronicity, if you read that, there's a whole chapter on their dialogue. And Pauli mentions it quite a bit, as well as Arthur Miller in his lecture that I referenced earlier. So if we look at Interstellar, what you have here is a secret space program that's having to cope with whatever the blight is that's messing up Earth's crops. And we're never certain if this was a result of actual human experimentation, chemtrailing, or what. It's not exactly clear, but Earth is not going to be inhabitable for whatever reason. Maybe the crops are all GMO'd, right? Monsanto got the upper hand or something, right? And so we have this curious statement early on that, now what I thought was neat that no one else seemed to cue into in the other reviews I read of it. I'm not bragging. I just didn't see anybody else pick up on this, but there's that curious scene at the beginning of the drone where the drone's flying around and Murphy says, "Hey, Dad, let's follow it." And Matthew McConaughey's running around and they follow it through this field and stuff. And it's almost like they treat it like it's this wounded animal or something, right? So it's
yeah.
They're like coaxing it and petting it and the poor drone. And so, but these events are organized, right? So these things that start happening on the farm that Matthew McConaughey's character is undergoing, Cooper, he starts realizing that there's patterns to these things. And so it's like it's an AI sort of intentional leading him down this road that leads him to where NASA is actually not defunct, because the textbooks, they say in the story, are that the moon landings are fake.
I love that element.
Yeah, and that there's no more NASA because we can't go to space. It's pointless. So we got to figure out how to fix the blight here on Earth. So things kind of revert to this agrarian society, right? So you're back to like 1950s America or 40s or something, right? So where most people are farmers and it's Midwestern or whatever. And so the moon landings are fake. They did it on a soundstage, but Cooper is led down this path of what all are kind of synchronicities, right? So it's as if the synchronicities are kind of organized by whatever this higher AI power is, right? Mm-hmm. And he comes to find that there's a secret NASA, and they're going to need to send him, to space and figure out what to do. We're not going to have any oxygen anymore. And Matthew McConaughey says he's going to fly his Lincoln into space. So I can't do a discussion of this without my Matthew McConaughey impersonation. So.
Yeah, that's not bad.
I'm sure most people have seen this film by now that are listening. And what I think is really neat about it is that what you have is the reversal of 2001, where HAL 9000 is kind of battling with Bowman, and then Bowman beats HAL 9000, and then he goes into into the beyond, into the infinite. Mm-hmm. So what happens here is that Cooper goes into the Tesseract, which is the next dimension, with the aid of AI. So it's that little monolith-looking TARS, T-A-R-S, that travels with him into the dimension that's higher up. Mm-hmm. And, you know, what's neat is that from Platonism, from mathematics, and from even professors like Lisa Randall or Brian Greene and these different physicists, they actually talk about how it's demonstrably mathematically provable that there are these higher dimensions like this. You can find an old clip of Carl Sagan outlining this on YouTube. Just type in Carl Sagan fourth dimension or something like that, higher dimensions, and you'll get this clip. It's been viewed by millions of people. And, you know, he's laying out how there is these higher dimensions. And in geometry, it's called a tesseract. If you ever read the novel when you were a kid, Wrinkle in Time is about a tesseract. Mm-hmm. So these are real things, I think. And so that's being portrayed, being revealed to us in this novel, in this film. And when he goes through to the other side, you basically find out that the apotheosis of man, the deification of man, is sort of this cooperative operation between humans and AI. And so we learned that that's actually who was guiding Cooper along, was actually future Cooper and humans or whoever, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like man maybe melding into AI, and then that's the source of how we go beyond the 4 dimensions or 3 dimensions that we inhabit presently, right? So it's all about the transcending of limitations, and the main limitations that humans can't transcend are time and space, right? Mm-hmm. So the film is all about the transcending of time and space, and that's what happens in the Tesseract when he's in the next dimension, and he's able to speak through. It's not time bound, it's not spatially bound, but actually through imagery and symbols.
Right.
So he can kind of speak in binary, or he can speak through books on our shelf, and these different it's almost like he's in the astral realm where he can speak at the speed of thought, right?
Yeah.
And that's what he does with Jessica Chastain. So I rewatched 2001, right? So, and by the way, I think that's ultimately what the secret space program is all about. It's all about, you know, this advanced tech and transhumanism is the real secret, right? So I was thinking about this, and then I went back and I watched 2001, and I wrote a whole brand new big ass analysis of that one. And I started realizing, you know what? At the end of 2001, when Bowman is fighting with Hal, when he shuts Hal down, that's what triggers the message to come on the screen that Bowman is actually on a secret space mission to go beyond and to follow the monolith, right? So it's almost like the monolith engineered that situation to lead Bowman to the next level.
Yeah, you
right?
could say that.
And I had never thought about it that way. I just always kind of thought about it like, oh, you got to beat the AI, and then it's, you know, man wins out, and, you know, man becomes Star Child or whatever. Mm-hmm. But it's almost like it's actually engineered, perhaps. I don't know. It's just an interesting thesis I took on it. So I kind of went back and thought, well, actually, maybe 2001 and Interstellar kind of have the same message, you know, because the monolith. If you look at the picture of Hal, where he's just a red dot,
yeah,
he's like a black screen with a red dot, right? Mm-hmm. So he actually kind of favors the monolith. And in Interstellar, the monoliths, they are the AI that are walking around with everybody, and they're monoliths, right? And so when you go back and you watch 2001, I read a book about Kubrick recently before I wrote this, and the monolith was actually supposed to be a screen. It was actually kind of supposed to be this advanced sort of AI. So it's almost like maybe the AI gods or God, right? It's like what's directing all of this, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what's leading man, you know, kind of out of this matrix, or however you want to conceive of it. So that was my take on it.
Yeah, man, I really love the movie Interstellar, but for a movie that already parallels 2001 in a lot of different ways, I did not like the choice of the AI, the Taurus, being the same exact shape as the monolith. I thought that it was a impractical choice for the machines to get around. And I guess, I don't know. I mean, did you find a deeper meaning in that exact replication? Because it seems too obvious for a
I
guy.
did.
For a guy.
Right.
Go ahead.
I think that. And I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm rambling a lot, but
no worries.
I thought that you're supposed to get the impression that like the NASA that's underground or whatever, like that's an older version. Like the TARS and whatever the accompanying model are older.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of experimental AI that maybe we might have now in reality or something, but they're still kind of slugging around NASA. And I think it's even mentioned that they're kind of having to work with what they have, right? Like they don't know for sure if what they've got in the narrative, can actually accomplish what they need Cooper to go do. So I think the choice was, on the one hand, to make it obvious that it's a monolith, and rather than my initial reading of 2001, where man versus AI, I think Nolan wants it to be that AI is what will take us to the next level. It's what will help us, and it doesn't have to be a thing where we have to worry about, Skynet and Terminator coming alive and whatever, like killing us or something. That it can be a positive thing. And I agree with that. It actually can be a positive thing. It doesn't have to be some negative thing. It's just a question of what humans choose to do with it. Just like a weapon, right? I mean, a weapon can be a good thing for self-defense, or it can be something that you can kill people with. So,
right.
Or commit murder. So in the same way, AI can be either a positive or a negative thing. It just depends on what humans choose to do with it. But that's what I saw it as. But like I said, when I went back and watched 2001, I kind of started thinking like maybe the monolith is actually is what Nolan is saying. Maybe it actually is like this AI thing, because in the original script that Kubrick and Clark wrote, the monolith has screens on it that are playing images that the apes watch. And if you remember at the end of Interstellar, the little boxes and monoliths that are walking around have screens on them.
Yeah. Huh.
That was actually what the monolith was supposed to be in 2001, but they decided not to do it because it would be too limiting. Because they didn't want people thinking like, oh, so the space gods are just TVs that fly around.
Yeah. And you talk about how intuition and love from humans, as well as the scientific thinking of the advanced AI, are both needed to complete the mission of transcending death in the movie Interstellar. I think that's a fascinating analysis. And now we're talking about 2001 being more of a cooperation between man and machine rather than a versus man and machine analysis. So I guess I'm curious, ultimately, is Interstellar a film meant to promote sympathetic feelings towards transhumanism and acceptance of a man-machine merger?
I think so. I really do. Because I think that's what, I think Nolan's point is, well, we're supposed to not have a space program anymore. And Obama supposedly defunded that a couple of years ago, which is all not true. That's NASA has always been a kind of a Hollywood front piece anyway.
Yeah.
But there has always been a real space program, and that's things like DARPA and the Star Wars Defense Initiative and the weaponization of space and the satellite programs and satellite internet and all that. The eyes in the sky, that's the real space program. And to what degree the advanced Foo Fighter hovering, floating discs and stealth bombers or whatever are advanced. I'm sure they're mega advanced, and we just aren't told about it. And so what that means, I'm not sure. How far have we gone in the galaxy? I don't know. Have we gone past the Van Allen belt? I don't know. But what I think we're just intentionally not being told any of that stuff for sure. And we're told a whole bunch of baloney. So on one level, Nolan is looking at kind of what the pop mind thinks about science and, space travel is pointless or whatever. I'm of the opinion, kind of like some of the Eastern Fathers said, that humans are actually made to sort of expand and colonize and terraform the universe. So that's my view. I think that we will do that. Mm-hmm. I think that it is meant to be done. And I think Nolan's saying, look, we can do this. AI doesn't have to be this, like I said, Terminator thing that comes alive and kills everybody. I think that there are eugenicists and people who do want to use AI for that purpose explicitly.
All right.
And I'm of the opinion, too, that computers are never going to be alive. And I have philosophical reasons why I believe that. But So I don't think that AI is ever going to be like sentient, and all they do is just sort of redefine what it means to be sentient to where anything that's operating is sentient. So like if I record myself on a computer, like the transhumanists will say, "Oh, that's you," right? No, that's not me. That's a simulation of me. But anyway,
right. That makes sense.
So that's just my view. But I think Nolan is saying we can't be completely scientific and rationalist. We got to have the human factor, and love is real. That was a big part of what Interstellar was about, was love.
Right.
And, the missing male with Cooper kind of being like Odysseus, where he's gone, and the masculine figure is no longer there. So that forces Jessica Chastain to kind of take on this masculine role. And she's, angry for a long time because her dad's gone, all mirroring Odysseus's journey and then his return. So, I think Nolan is kind of saying, look, we know transhumanism's coming and the AI is coming. So let's try to do positive with this and not let it be a negative thing where we have to worry that HAL 9000 is going to, nuke us all or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. And to talk about NASA a little bit, so much of what we know, of course, when it comes to space comes from NASA, and also the Hollywood industry and sci-fi movies definitely shape our view of what space is like. And it's just, I'm having a real problem lately with my audience because some guests, if they cite NASA for anything, if they have any theories that branch off of NASA data, it's like the audience just dismisses them outright because, like you said, it's been a Hollywood PR front piece. But I guess the question is to what extent? Because now people, the flat earth is getting a resurgence, and there are people who write me that they don't even think that the planets are really out there because the only ones who are really viewing them are NASA. And it gets really crazy. I mean, where do we draw the line between what is really out in space and what has been shown to us through, a bunch of illusions?
Yeah, great question. And unfortunately, there's not simple answers to any of these questions. And so I have a friend, a good buddy of mine for a long time. He's an aerospace engineer. He contracted with NASA for a while. So NASA does do some real stuff, right? So it's not completely fake.
Right.
They do shoot real rockets and all that. Now, beyond that, it's very hard to say exactly what's going on because just my opinion, when I see these Mars images, and NASA's been doing this forever, they've been saying, "Oh, we found water on Mars, found life on Mars," and it's always just a CGI image, right?
Yes.
So where's the real thing? Why don't you just show us a good HD picture of it, instead of these dumb, Max Headroom looking like 1989 CGI pictures?
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. I know there is a secret space program. I know for a fact there is. They talk about the black budget for it. I know the Star Wars Defense Initiative was launched at Bohemian Grove. I know, Operation Paperclip was real and all that. Werner von Braun was real. They were, designing rockets and shooting them and so forth. But now then when you get into these deeper physics questions and metaphysics questions, it's very, very difficult to parcel out the true from the false. So, at the same time, you got disinformation and Psy-Ops going on with the reality questioning aspects of what we're being presented with in alternative media. In other words, it can go so extreme that people are wanting you to like question everything, right? So like nothing is real,
Yeah.
And what that does is lead you right into the philosophical view of solipsism. So, then everything's just like a projection of my mind, right? So there have been philosophers who've espoused this and played with it. Descartes plays with this notion in his Meditations. And that quickly leads to absurdity because, as I've said many times, you can just deconstruct this philosophically and show that it's nonsense by saying, well, if everything is illusory and fake, then my discovery that everything is illusory and fake is also fake. Right. So then that's contradictory and self-refuting. So I don't think that's a road we want to go down. We can have in philosophy, what's called general reliability of our sense perceptions. So empirical data is vital. That doesn't mean that I'm an empiricist. I write quite a bit against empiricism, but empirical data, absolutely. It's very crucial, very important. Do as much investigation and firsthand, inspection as you can. But I don't know. There are all kinds of anomalies about physics that don't line up to the classic physics that we're told from Newtonian era and from materialistic, naturalistic Darwinism down, that just do not make sense. Mm-hmm. Does that mean I think that flat Earth is correct? No, I don't. Something about that's not sitting right. But I do think there are things that they're pointing out about physics and metaphysics that don't make sense with what we're told in orthodox academia, so-called.
Right. I'm right there with you. That's the same value I get out of listening to that camp, is all the holes they poke in the official stories. I'm like, yeah, I'm right there with you. I just don't come to the same conclusion. But something else I wanted to ask you about, we're getting down to the wire, but I do see you commenting on the state of alternative thinkers and the conspiracy community occasionally, and the themes that come and go in these circles. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the alternative community, what are some of the major themes or views that you take issue with? Where are shows like this one missing the mark at times?
Well, I tend to take a pretty relaxed approach to letting people do what they want and have the guests on that they want to talk about. And I do that because I don't have too strict of a policy about what shows I go on. So if somebody will have me on and let me state my views, I'll go on their show. I don't care. But I'll also, make clear if I disagree about something. But as an alternative media as a whole is kind of a circus. It tends to mirror the mainstream media in many ways. So you'll see stories going around quite consistently that are fake, that are bullshit, that just get repeated in the mainstream media because they're in they get repeated in alternative media because they're in the mainstream media. So the mainstream media reports on ISIS compounds in Mexico and ISIS crossing the border. And then the alternative media just mirrors these. But at the same time, we're told that ISIS is not real in the alternative media.
Yeah.
Well, these two things can't be true. They're not the same. They're different claims, right? So there's no ISIS crossing the border. That's complete bullshit. But you'll see this mirrored all through alternative media. You'll see certain sites talk about, and it's the same crap that was on other sites 10 years ago, back in 2005, that Al Qaeda was crossing the Mexican border with nukes. Complete bullshit. Not true. Nukes are being stolen everywhere and they're running around loose. That's bullshit. Not true. So there's basically alternative media is just about as much bullshit as the mainstream media. So, it's hard to find really, really good, solid podcasts and shows out there. That's not anything about you or any particular group. I'm just giving my overall assessment. So I just do my own thing. I just don't even worry about it. I don't care who's doing what in alternative media. It tends to be a circus, and I just go about my business.
Right. That's fair. I always like to ask when I have a guest that I think will talk about the conspiracy community broadly, because it is tough. I mean, I try to avoid the pitfalls. I try to avoid the disinformation, but again, so much is unverifiable. Yeah. You're kind of left with just your own general discernment. And I'm sure I've had guests on that had an agenda that I wasn't aware of and pushed a position that maybe served some higher purpose in the grand conspiracy. But
I'm sure I have too. Yeah. Sure.
Right. It's just, we do what we can, but it is fun to talk about and analyze the community we're in.
I agree. I think it's, my approach is, do your own thing and don't worry about it and go about your business and, state what you think and research as best you can. Use your critical thinking. Don't be duped into bullshit.
Right on, man. Cheers to that. And that just about does it for us. I mean, I very much enjoyed having you here, man. So many things we could have talked about. Hopefully we can do it again sometime, but,
anytime.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Before we go, would you like to remind people where they can read your work and catch you live coming up at the end of the month?
Yes. You can go to jaysanalysis.com. I think I have there's 700 posts. About 600 of them are my articles. About 100 of them are the film reviews. So all kinds of stuff there. I will be speaking at the Esoteric, the Secret Space Program conference, and my lecture will be Predictive Programming and the Secret Space Agenda. That's October 31st to November 1st in Bastrop, Texas /Austin, that area. If you want to help me out, then if you buy some tickets, put in the code SSP Dyer 2015, and that'll give you a discount. That's also how I get paid for the people that use my code. And I would also like to mention that my subscriber site offers philosophy lectures that touch on all the kinds of topics that we mentioned today, but they tend to be a little more academic. So if you're interested in learning philosophy, getting into the primary texts of Plato and Aristotle and different historical pieces, that's what I offer to subscribers for $4.95 a month, and you get those once a week. And there's an archive you can access as well, with a bunch of interviews too. So it's not just boring philosophy talks. It's exciting, sexy philosophy talks. And I would also like to mention I have upcoming show with Natural News they're starting a radio program. And so my show will be Esoteric Hollywood, and that'll be premiering next week as well.
Awesome. Very cool, man. Well, thanks again. I did have a blast. Take care of yourself out there and have a great time in Austin. Well, there it is. Another show in the bag. I thought Jay made a great guest. I really like going into cinema symbolism, and I think this branched off into a bunch of interesting areas. Angelic script and the nature of synchronicities, links between magic and technology. You know, those things are right up my alley for sure. I liked how product placement came up early on. It's funny how we're seeing a mainstream splash of stories about ISIS using Toyota trucks. Ale Demengard, he mentioned that months ago. It's like Toyota didn't get enough out of it, and Russia came in to end ISIS so quickly they throw out a news media blitz about stories detailing this connection, and they all did the rounds. No real information given or conclusion drawn, just ISIS used Toyota trucks. And if you listen to any mainstream news in the past couple of weeks, I think you've probably heard that. I guess critics would say that that's bad press, but nobody is linking Toyota to terrorism in their mind. It's just about brand repetition over and over, and they know how it works. I wasn't sure then if there was something going on, but once all the big shows took that story, you know that's handed down from on high, and it's just a funny thing. So it was a pretty good first hour, but if you're a member of THC Plus and you listened to that second hour, you know we got into the new movie The Martian, as well as Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Wag the Dog, True Detective, Mad Max, and Jurassic World. So many movies we didn't even touch American Ultra, because that's just too obvious. We talked about Saturnian symbolism, mind control, sex cults, the idea that a lot of pop stars could be victims of this abuse. We talked about filmmakers who might have revealed too much, ritual murders involving Hollywood, and the idea that some of these celebrity deaths and other high-profile deaths could be staged or done with the use of a double so that some of these people could fake their own deaths and then retire somewhere. And we talked about the intensive work Jay has done breaking down the cult of scientism and how that affects the culture, as well as Tesla and some of the reasons why he was a badass. I hope you liked it. I hope you found it action-packed. Please make sure to check out jaysanalysis.com to dig into all his stuff. And if you're going to be going to the Secret Space Program Conference in Austin, you can see him there. Next week is the return of one of my favorite guests and another guest from the conference. Maybe I'll keep it a surprise, but I will give you the hint of saying the phrase cosmic war. I'm sure a lot of you know what that means. So keep doing what you do, people. Enjoy the day. Make some progress towards those goals. Buck the system. Break free from the chains. Watch out for the temple guards. Tell your boss to shove it and start playing to win. I'm Greg Carlwood, and I declare this meeting of the Midnight Society closed. All right, Higherside Chatters, we know that from the printing press to the film reel, mediums of mass communication have always been weaponized and used as the main vehicles for propaganda and culture creation. And along with the school system dead set on churning out obedient servants to the management class, movies and media act as the pacifiers that make many people just content enough with their life of servitude. Well, today's returning guest, Jay Dyer, has been picking apart the titans of Tinseltown for many years on his website, Jay's Analysis, where he methodically breaks down dozens of films to expose the hidden agendas and symbolism they contain. He also writes extensively on philosophy, geopolitics, history, conspiracy, esoterica, and more, and we got him here hot on the heels of his great new book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. It's a real treat to have him here once again. Jay, my man, welcome back to the Higher Side.
Thank you, Greg. Always a pleasure. I'm glad to be back. We had a really good time last time talking about science fiction and propaganda, and I'm sure this will be equally as exciting.
Yeah, man, I really loved that last episode. I think we also focused a lot on Ian Fleming and the Bond films. Mm-hmm. Interstellar was pretty fresh at that time, too.
Exactly.
And I also really enjoyed this new book of yours, and maybe a good place to start with that is that one of the first sections is called Film as Ritual, which is provocative, but how closely related do you think film and ritual really are? How are they similar?
Well, the idea of ritual could be many things, right? I mean, we generally think of it as a kind of religious ceremony that has some connection to deities or the divine or the celestial. And in modern parlance, I guess we've kind of disconnected the idea of theater and plays and acting from that milieu, but that's actually where it comes from. If you go back to ancient Greece, the idea of Sophocles, of Antigone, of the theater was bound up with the idea of the gods and the stories of the gods. And, it's the same with Homer, Odysseus, the Iliad, all of that. And so what I tried to do was kind of go back to that ancient perspective and get a window into that. And I did a lecture, I think about a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago, on Plato's Ion, which is a dialogue that not many people are aware of. ION is the name of the dialogue. And it's a conversation that Socrates has with some poets and musicians. And they're saying, hey, Socrates, like, you don't know what truth is, man. You think it's all this philosophizing and analytical stuff, and it's inspiration. That's the true truth. And Socrates says, no, you guys are actually just kind of Dionysian madmen. He says you're inspired by these spirits, and conceivably, there is evidence to suggest that in ancient Greece they actually were perhaps taking hallucinogens and narcotics and things like this. So it's entirely possible that those in the arts, musicians and so forth, poets, were under the influence of drugs and so forth. So in that regard, Plato and Socrates basically say that it's alternate spirits, alternate gods, alternate other personalities or entities, quote unquote, that are kind of inspiring this performance or this play or whatever. And when we fast forward to probably the most popular modern school or technique of serious acting that most of the A-listers are into, you get to the Stanislavski method, which is the method acting of Konstantin Stanislavski, who's like a Russian dude from about 100 years ago. And his whole idea was that you could, through his craft, through his methodology, invoke and sort of take on these other personalities. So that's the perspective that I'm kind of coming from and looking at. And what's interesting is that, whether you believe that there are actual alternate personalities or spirits or things that people take on or invoke, or entities that might invade someone's psyche or conscious mind or something like that, whether you believe in that or not, people do believe in that. And so they will operate on that belief system, and perhaps under the influence of drugs or rituals or ceremonies or magic or whatever that they're into, they may actually sort of go into this sort of furor, this kind of berserk sort of state, which is what Plato was talking about. So that's what I start with. That's why I started film as ritual, because acting in the ancient world was ritual.
Yeah, man, I love it. That idea that theater and the practice of acting out those mythological stories is like an attempt to draw down the power of those entities.
Yeah.
It's deep stuff, and it's like pretty out there, I think, for a lot of people, but I mean, it makes sense. And do you think that there is a bit of that drawing down of the spirits going on in modern filmmaking as well?
Well, many of the A-listers are openly into method acting. So again, I'm not saying that I can prove that they actually do it or that they're possessed or anything like that. But what I'm saying is that they believe and act upon the philosophy of Konstantin Stanislavski, which was occultic in nature. And so he really thought that you could have an alternate persona step in and take over your persona.
Right.
So that's the goal. Now, whether they actually do that is, I'm sure, debatable. But I mean, how many times have we seen people, for example, like if they have a bad trip, right? The story is that, in Apocalypse Now, who is it, Martin Sheen, right? I mean, he's supposed to be really tripping when he goes crazy in that scene, famous scene in Apocalypse Now. So again, this is method acting.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we've talked on the show about the idea of alternate personalities. I mean, this happens a lot in Hollywood and music. I mean, so many actors don't even use their real name, which is kind of strange. I mean, there's no other field like that. And then even within that, you'll have a lot of musicians in particular who have alternate personalities, which seems like a weird thing to do when you're trying to build a specific brand and you've done all this work to build up Beyonce and now you're Sasha Fierce, or you've built up Garth Brooks and now you're whatever his alternate persona was that he used. Very weird that they do that at all. And it kind of connects to this idea of being more of a vessel for various personalities or taking on various personas. So I think you're onto something.
Well, a lot of people think that that's not real. And I will fully admit that in the case of, pop stars and things like that, that it's entirely possible that a lot of it's just marketing, right? So maybe when there's going to be a new Beyonce album or, David Bowie or whoever, they're going to take on a new marketing persona of Ziggy Stardust or Sasha Fierce or whatever. So it's entirely possible that that is marketing. But I also have read a lot of books from psychiatrists and sociologists and psychologists. For example, there's one that's pretty popular called Switching Time. And this is, I believe, a psychiatrist, several years counseling a woman with multiple personalities. Now, that could be fake. I've heard some good argumentation suggesting that the classic story Sybil was fake. But then again, the source calling it fake was NPR. So NPR is not the most reliable source. So the idea of splits and alters and all this is very, I guess, controversial and debated. And when you look at the reason why a lot of people dismiss it, the basis is it's things like, it's not possible because it doesn't fit with the idea of materialistic, reductionistic Darwinism or something like this. Like, the brain is just matter. And since we're not seeing anything actually splitting under the microscope or something like this, then it's not possible. Well, that just is assuming that the mind or the psyche or the soul is in itself material, which is an unproven assumption, again, based on a person's belief in materialism. However, if the soul and the psyche exist, then that opens up all kinds of, and it's not strictly material, quote unquote, then that opens up, all kinds of possibilities for what may actually be going on. And I tend to believe that we don't fully know and understand the things of the soul and the psyche. I mean, the Bible even says this. In Paul's letters, Paul says, man doesn't even comprehend his own spirit. So how is he going to make these sort of definitive so-called scientific claims about what's possible in the realm of the psyche? So anyway,
yeah,
I would say that, and I remember, like, even in college, the first time I encountered this idea, one of my first college classes was a psychology class. And we watched some videos on people with multiple personality disorder, or DID. And I think to all appearances, it appears to be real. I don't see how all of these people could be all faking this. So I tend to think it's real. Now, how developed that is in terms of, can they literally call forth all these different persons through trigger words and keywords? This is actually the plot of this new M. Night Shyamalan movie, which I thought was actually really good.
Yeah, Split.
Called Split. And I went and saw that. I thought it was great. I enjoyed it. I tend to think that, obviously that's a little bit Hollywooded up, but if you read a book like Switching Time, it seems to line up pretty clear with that. And I would say that that would be my suspicion as to what really goes on. But do I know if Brittany has multiple personalities? Well, she acts pretty loony sometimes, and she looks like there's these different personas. And so I wouldn't be surprised in her case, because I have seen some interviews where she does seem to act very goofy and change her personality totally.
Right.
I've seen people have freakouts on drugs where it's not just them freaking out. Like, it appears to me that somebody else was running that machine. The ghost in the machine was switched out. There was some other ghost in there.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think there's something to this for sure. Again, I agree with you. Like, it's about determining to what degree, but yeah, there's something to it for sure. And I'm curious, do you see film being good vehicles for occult aims outside of invocation? Are there other things in that occult esoteric toolbox that are being manifested through film?
Are there good aspects? Sure, sure. I don't think, all the films are nefarious or propaganda. Several chapters in my book are kind of lighthearted and goofy and satirical. So they're not really to be taken, too seriously. I think the Logan's Run and the Zardoz chapters are pretty, there's some deep, dark stuff in those films, but for the most part, they're just kind of fun and satirical sci-fi versions of like Plato's allegory of the cave. And I don't think those are necessarily, nefarious.
Fair points. But to clarify, and I did say good vehicles, but I don't mean good in a moral sense, but I'm more curious if you see films acting as useful mechanisms for other occult aims besides the invocation aspect we talked about, other things in the magical toolbox. For example, I sometimes hear people suggest that a major aim of mass media in Hollywood is to replace our imagination or to have us outsource our ability to visualize because they know how important the connection between consciousness and matter is and that we can influence our reality, but not if they bombard us with all this filler from a young age.
Huh.
So I guess I'm really asking if you see other occult related purposes for the Hollywood machine other than the entity energy drawdown aspect that you had laid out already.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I have seen my buddy John brought this to my attention, John Adams over at Hostbusters. He said, if you look at the book, I forget the title of it off the top of my head, but, and I did look it up, Gregory Bateson, who is one of the sort of MK Ultra guys in the background, he wrote a book where he did actually talk about capturing man's imagination. And he saw that the need to control creativity and imagination was very important for social engineering because, in my view, this is really the function of Disney, right? It's like it is all about, quote, imagination. And what they've done with Disney is totally weaponize it to capture your children's imagination and really turn it into a lot of dark social engineering things. Like, they want to take your kid and take her from being Hannah Montana and turn her into gender fluid, disgusting, slutty Miley Cyrus. So that's the real goal of capturing the imagination.
Yeah, man, Disney is quite a force, and I really do enjoy when people break down Disney films. Sometimes it goes too far, I will admit. And I actually checked out some of the songs on YouTube from that new one, Mona, and I guess The Rock plays a demigod character, I assume from Hawaiian mythology. I think that's what it's all about. And there is a line in one of his songs where he describes making the world, and at one point he says, I killed an eel, buried its guts, sprouted a tree, now you have coconuts. And I just thought, that's a fairly detailed ritual description right there. Bit of an evolution from when you wish upon a pentagram. And I am being facetious, but I've heard some researchers make a really compelling case that however small, there is a very purposeful occult thread through a lot of those films.
That's an interesting point. I haven't followed much Disney stuff or kid stuff in general. I tend to focus on more, well, at least in the first book, that I did, it was mainly things that I grew up with, Spielberg movies, Hitchcock movies, James Bond, Kubrick, things that I watched growing up in high school and stuff like that. So, but I'm sure that, you could definitely go a whole other rabbit hole, into kids' films and all the programming and stuff like that. But again, I think that the main tool of what they do with the kids' films is promote mindless sort of rebellion, promote, well, as you mentioned there, it's sort of the capturing of the imagination and turning it to really just the service of the system. I mean, Disney, for example, was for a long time involved in promoting government propaganda and military recruitment. That was a big part of what Disney himself stood for. He had access to and worked at the Laurel Canyon Studios where they did all these secret Air Force films and so forth that I discussed in the book that comes from Dave McGowan's work.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that is a good question. I mean, definitely the kids aspect is something that could be explored more. But I mean, I've seen all kinds of dastardly stuff from Nickelodeon and MTV, and that I think is genuinely intended to have negative effects on your children. I mean, the whole goal of all of it is depopulation.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a stretch, but I've even heard people talking about the sliming of kids on Nickelodeon being, symbolic of semen. I mean, and that might be a stretch, but I'm like, that is kind of creepy too when you think about it in that context. But let's get into Spielberg a little bit. You write about him a decent amount in Esoteric Hollywood, breaking down several of his movies. And if there were a larger, semi-organized machine behind Hollywood, Spielberg would have to be involved. So when you look at the totality of his films, do you see an overarching aim or agenda that becomes more clear?
Yeah, I think you could boil down like probably three major themes that Spielberg deals with. He deals with Holocaust, he deals with familial relations, and he deals with aliens. That's the three things that he's focused on. So what I aliens / transhumanism and so forth. So what I focused on in my book was the alien and transhuman myths and stories that he's focused on. And so he interestingly does have a penchant for Philip K. Dick, who I think is very fascinating as a writer and a character, because Spielberg did Minority Report. So there's a chapter on Minority Report that I do that focuses on dystopia and how tech can lead to dystopia. So not everything in Spielberg is bad. I don't think he's totally nefarious or anything like that. And I don't actually go after anybody personally, or any of the directors. I just kind of try to decode the films and see what patterns and meanings I can find in the symbolism. So what is Spielberg all about? Well, as I said, aliens and transhumanism. And I think those two things are linked. For one, because I personally am not convinced that there's like extra biological entities. But I think that if you watch movies like E.T. and then you watch something like his version of War of the Worlds, the cold, calculated, scientific approach that the so-called aliens have sure does seem to match up to the cold, calculated, scientific approach of the deep state and the military-industrial complex and the international corporations.
Yeah.
They have that because, so at the end of Close Encounters, what's it all about? Well, they're stealing, abducting kids and family members. And you get the impression at the very, very end that they're doing some kind of genetic modification on these people. And then they're giving them back to you 20 years later or something, and they haven't aged. So the idea is, the quote alien, the overlords are working on genetic modification, hybridization, GMOs, halting the aging process, all these kinds of things that we in the conspiracy world really believe the oligarchs are working on and are into. So I think that's the real meaning of something like Close Encounters, which actually kicked off the modern alien Hollywood blockbuster phenomena. I can't really think. I mean, there probably were alien movies, no doubt, many of them prior to Close Encounters, but making aliens into a giant blockbusters, it begins, I would say, with, if you don't count 2001, which I tend to believe 2001's about AI, not so-called aliens, but extraterrestrial beings. You get Close Encounters, which is based on J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée, right? This is both of their works were kind of the basis for what was going on in Close Encounters. And actually, I believe Hynek, I found sources saying that J. Allen Hynek was actually consulting Spielberg on the set. So I think that you're talking about people from the deep state who know about what the UFO phenomenon really is, sort of consulting with Spielberg. Spielberg's putting out his version of it. And, then when you look at E.T., I think E.T. is actually about this idea of E.T.'s more like a familiar spirit than he is like an alien. Yeah. That's why he has this very strange bonded connection with Elliot. And, when E.T. gets drunk and burps, Elliot's drunk and belching, right?
Yeah. This is
so very, very weird stuff going on there. But
Yeah, man. And this is exactly what I wanted to get into, because I love that ET analysis, and it's just so interesting. You talk about in the film ET, you mentioned the shadow government researcher in the movie is named Keys, and that it's a reference to the Key of Solomon. And let's get into this a bit. What is the significance there? Is that message part of the subtly saying that ET is a familiar spirit or a demon rather than a space alien?
I would say so, because you look at what his so-called powers are, and they match up much closer to something like a familiar spirit, supposedly, than it does any sort of, quote, alien. It's almost as if Elliot invokes ET to come, and they have this. It's almost like ET is his higher self, or his, sort of holy guardian angel or something. And I think there's a lot of bizarre sort of Crowleyan-ish imagery in the film too, with the moon child and Elliot flying across the moon as a child. This kind of stuff. I think that's suggestive. It's not definitive, but it's suggestive. And so the Peter Coyote character, that's the guy who's playing Keys, he shows up at the beginning and then he pops up later at the end, and he's actually this sort of mysterious, almost angelic government figure who's turns out to be a good guy, because he's opening up all of these scenarios. At least that's how I read it. And actually, I think Roger Ebert says something similar to that in his book, The Great Movies, when he looks at E.T. So anyway, it's a different take on E.T. definitely that I have. But the actual guy, Peter Coyote, interestingly, was a hardcore Marxist, and he was a big time sort of activist, quote unquote, in terms of Marxism and cultural revolution. So, I think that's potentially suggests, I'm not saying he is an occultist or anything like that for sure, but it's just interesting that, you don't see this guy in a lot of movies, and then Spielberg chooses him for this role. I don't know why, but ultimately, I think what E.T. was the propagation of a rebranding of the alien mythology for a generation of youth, right? So I was Elliot's age when E.T. came out. So that was targeted at people my generation. And I think the goal of that was a rebranding of, quote, aliens, not to be something nefarious or dangerous and some otherworldly threat, but something that we should embrace. And when you get to my Prometheus chapter, what I argue is that the reason that we're being warmed up to, quote, aliens for so long, and why Hollywood just constantly turns out alien movies like nonstop, is not just for blockbuster ticket sales. It's actually, I think, to sort of warm us up for the acceptance of a new global religion that melds better with Darwinism. And I think that, as I argue in the H.G. Wells Spielberg chapter in the book, I believe that we've been prepped for this for a long time, going all the way back to the science fiction and predictive programming of H.G. Wells. And that's why Spielberg chooses things like War of the Worlds.
Fascinating, man. And I love that E.T. example. I remember when I was a kid, you even note the fact that E.T. glows as maybe an element of him being more of a familiar. And I remember when I was young, I was like, why does this thing glow? It just doesn't look right. Thought it was awkward, but it makes the point that maybe it's a spiritual entity rather than something from space.
Yeah, and I think that the planetary connections that we see in the film also suggest planetary deities, right? And this is kind of how the Key of Solomon or ancient mythology would have viewed E.T. and the gods, quote unquote.
I also like the thing that you point out that the government agents arrive in NASA spacesuits in the movie. And that is so weird. Why would you be in a spacesuit anywhere but space? But it's in there.
Yeah, I've always thought that was odd. And so how do we read this? How do we make sense of this? Well, once we have a broader perspective of things like Kubrick, and we realize that Kubrick was working with NASA, which I touch on in the book. And, if we've seen the work from, let's say, Jay Wiedner on Kubrick and the moon landings and that theory, I think that, and especially given the fact that Spielberg took over Kubrick's script AI, and changed it to aliens and stuff like this, which I don't think Kubrick had in the original story. There's some nods and crossovers between Spielberg to Kubrick And I've always just wondered if that wasn't some kind of nod or hint that the moon landings and Apollo and all this kind of stuff is not what we are told.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at other nods and instances in films that I touch on in the book, like Diamonds Are Forever, well, there's this scene where, James Bond runs onto a movie set where they're filming the moon landing.
Yep. I love it, man. And you also even note the similarities in titles between E.T. and that Kubrick-Spielberg collaboration of AI. And you say that it could be a mystagogical code for the origins of advanced artificial technology as channeled from interdimensional alien gods. Great sentence. And I love that idea. I've been hearing it more and more that technology comes from connections to entities like Prometheus bringing us fire.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your impression of where a lot of technology comes from? Some type of occult workings?
I do think that that's possible. And I believe that not just because of, some kind of weird thesis or something I dreamed up, but actually when you go into the history of philosophers or sort of the pioneers of modern technology, you can look at characters like Descartes. You can look at somebody like John Dee was, of course, interested in alchemy and things like that too.
Yeah.
But Leibniz, G.W. Leibniz, the famous continental philosopher who's the co-founder of calculus with Newton, Leibniz was very interested in alchemy and the esoteric and metaphysics and things like this and Platonism. And he is one of the formative figures kind of dreaming up the possibility of a computer or a logic machine. So there's always been in, Jewish mysticism, the idea of the golem, which is the creation of a robot being or a synthetic human. And so I think we have nascent in the mythology a lot of the hints and primeval. I mean, you could almost argue that's kind of predictive programming, like ancient mythology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is almost a kind of primeval predictive programming for what is possible with technology and alchemy. So I know that might be debatable and people might howl at that and think that I'm crazy, but I mean, maybe it was just his own clever insight, but how was Leibniz dreaming up the possibility of a computer, back in the 1500s?
Mm-hmm.
How did, Da Vinci was like sketching out helicopters and stuff. I mean,
right. Well, where do our ideas come from? We don't really know.
We don't know. That's what I'm trying to say. And that's what I was getting at earlier about, the psyche and splitting of the psyche and all that, is that I hold that out as a very likely thesis, much more likely than the Darwinian reductionist thesis, because, we don't even know what the source of our stream of consciousness thought process is.
Right.
So how are we going to make these sort of definitive claims about, oh, it's absolutely impossible that there's a spiritual realm, or, that we could receive the impressions of ideas or creativity from those kinds of sources?
Right. I mean, the idea of the muse goes back as far as artists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's interesting, man. And to talk about AI a little bit more, it came out in 2001, probably for specific reasons. But do you see its messages and themes becoming any more poignant in the decade plus since the film was made?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of why I chose that one to be in the book. Because there was probably 90 to 100 film analyses I had to leave out. That maybe they'll make up, part 2 or 3 or something. But that one I chose because it fit with the theme that I was looking at from Spielberg, transhumanism and synthetic future and all this kind of stuff, synthetic dystopia, basically. And so I argued that AI is a kind of transhumanist fairy tale, that what he's done is taken the Pinocchio myth and reformulated it for modernity. And again, this was taken from Kubrick. This was actually a Kubrick screenplay that Spielberg took over and altered, and of course added in aliens. Anything with Spielberg's got to have aliens in there. Mm-hmm. But it functions, I believe, on multiple levels. So it's not just about the possibilities of AI. It's also, in a nefarious sense, if you notice the David character, the AI character, he's portrayed as this sort of Edenic, innocent, I mean, he is the future of, quote, humanity, but he's humanity 2.0. We make him in our image, right?
Mm-hmm.
As kind of new gods or new creators. And I'm sure everybody's seen the film, so you're aware of the fact that humanity dies out, right? And the film begins with this sort of eugenics, green Agenda 21 type message of the Earth has been flooded from global polar ice caps melting or some nonsense like this. And, there's only these kind of sparse human communities, and the bots are persecuted. And so Spielberg has the bots put into a lot of these Holocaust type scenarios and narratives where they're being trucked off in carts, and they're taken to the flesh fair, which is this Dante's Inferno style torture scenario.
Yeah.
And so what I'm getting at here is that they're treated as the new civil rights victims. Now, 20, 30 years ago, nobody would have believed it possible. Everybody would have laughed if you had said, we're entering the phase in the near future where bots and cyborgs and transhumanism and people who get, body mod and all this kind of stuff, that's actually going to be a new civil right / human right or cyborg right.
Yeah.
That is now being discussed, right? This is where we're going. That is going to be what we talk about in the next decade, 20 years. There will be, I'm not joking, this is so we went from racial civil rights to gay rights, and then the next, quote, civil right is going to be related to transhumanism. And maybe I'm forgetting like bestiality or something, right? Like that's going to be bestiality and pedophilia that will be discussed as a, quote, right. And make no mistake about it, you heard it here on Higherside Chats, transhumanism and cyborg modification will be the next right.
Boom.
And all of that, I think, is being predicted and projected and displayed in AI, and also in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, which is another chapter in the book.
And there's also quite a bit of Kabbalistic influence in AI too, right?
Absolutely. This whole idea of word magic, and this is something that I did touch on too.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention themes in Spielberg. You mentioned themes. Well, language and meaning and interpersonal communication is a huge aspect of Spielberg. That's why, if you remember in Close Encounters, the aliens don't know how to communicate with us. So they have to eventually use sound, and, they decode the sound, do, 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 right?
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes the form of language. But the Lacombe character, who's played by Francois Truffaut, the famous French director, is based on Jacques Vallée, and he decodes this message. The way that he decodes is that he hears a bunch of Hindus singing the sort of chant. And if you study how Hindus view their chants, they actually view it as a ritual invocation. And so when you hit certain frequencies, they believe, through sound, you're actually harmonizing with the wavelength where those gods reside. So what's weird is that the chant that they're actually putting out is Aya, Aya, Ye, which is very close to the Tetragrammaton or Yahweh, right? And of course, Spielberg, being Jewish and being aware and I would say very obviously familiar with Kabbalism, I think that's where he's coming from. That's the vantage point he's coming from. And so that's where you get to the arguments that I make about things like using A period, I period, and then using E period, T period, right? These are done on purpose because letters are symbols, and they also have a lot of different meanings in gematria, or they can stand for different things in different schools of Kabbalism.
Mm-hmm.
So where were we? I forgot what were we talking about? Kabbalism or
Kabbalism in AI.
Oh, in AI. Well, so there's word magic in AI when his mom, David's mom, says these magic words that give him consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that there's a lot of different things you could read from that. I would tend to stick it in the Kabbalistic narrative because this is the idea of the golem, right? And this is Jewish mysticism, the idea of that you could use different Hebrew sounds and words and symbols to, in a way, be a theurgist or be a creator and cause life, quote unquote, to be.
Right. She also touches buttons on his chakra points too, doesn't she?
Yes, that's a great point. She touches the back of his neck, I think, if I recall, and then says the magic words. And he supposedly is, quote, conscious. So now I don't believe that actually we will ever create a conscious being like that. I think that it will always be synthetic. It will always be in some way a kind of program. And anything that you program is only going to do what it's programmed to do, in my view. So, but I do think that, the AI, transhumanism, all this stuff is developing to the extent that people will believe that it's conscious and that it's alive, and that's how they will sell it as a new civil right. And then old humanity, old man, will be declared obsolete, as they promote the new man, the bot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man, I think this is so interesting, especially this idea of sci-fi movies like E.T. and Close Encounters and War of the Worlds. This idea that they have cemented a lot of our thoughts about space and aliens in culture, even more so than real science has. And maybe it is to get us to accept demons as cool via the alien skin. But I've also had some guests who are pretty far out there and in the flat earth territory, and they would say that Hollywood and NASA CGI is where we get our ideas of outer space, when really we're stuck in a snow globe. And I don't think you're a flat earther, but if space is largely like it's depicted in films, are there other aspects that are being manipulated? Is it just the alien demon thing, or do you think there's more to that sliver of the pie?
I don't believe that we really know what is out there. I think that there's a lot of different theories, and just like with the psyche, people try to have these definitive declarations and pronouncements about what exists and what's possible and what's not possible. Mm-hmm. And they really don't know. And I think that's a big part of the system, is giving the impression that they do know, a kind of confidence game.
Yeah.
When they don't. Now, a lot of things we do know in terms of science, but I believe that real science and real advancement in those regions, those areas, comes about in things like technology and engineering, mm-hmm. computer science. All that stuff's real. NASA is a PR front under the aegis of the Air Force. So their number one job, that is the military, is lying to the public. That's what Psy-Ops is.
Yeah.
So you can't believe any of these declarations from NASA, and just look at the fact that NASA, on the one hand, promotes aliens and then turns around and tries to present itself as this totally scientific organization. But it's not. It's a PR front. It's intimately tied with Hollywood. That's why Ridley Scott was talking about how his movie Mars was released in tandem with NASA's supposed Mars discoveries. When that last Matt Damon movie came out, whenever that was, like a few months ago. Right. James Cameron sits on the board of NASA directors. Why is this Hollywood director sitting? I think that's all suggestive of deception. I don't believe in the flat Earth because of the fact that, you can fly from Santiago to Sydney in 8 or 10 hours or so, something like that, mm-hmm. which is impossible on that goofy flat Earth map. I don't think that, the entire military and GPS and logistics would all be off. Everything would be working all fucked up mm-hmm. if the Earth were flat. My dad was in the Navy. He sailed around the globe. So I think that's all a bunch of psyops and ridiculous deception, in my view. I'm fine with people questioning things. I would tend to think that there's a good case to be made for geocentrism. I think you could argue that one. But no, I don't believe that we live on a pizza crust.
Yeah, it's just interesting because if Hollywood's big aim is to kind of control the way we think, or to make us feel confident about what's beyond our atmosphere, I just wonder if it's different in any way than what's depicted in the movies. We might never know.
Well, I do believe that. I do believe it's different than what we're told in movies. But I think that Hollywood had its main goal or role in this regard in terms of promoting things like Darwinism. And you say, well, there's not that many movies that promote Darwinism. Actually, all science fiction movies do. Almost all of them across the board. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a gospel of Darwinism. So I'm very critical of that in the book, and I don't approach Darwinism as most people do, just from like a list of arguments that they read online or something. I approach it as a philosopher. That was my grad training was in analytical philosophy, so I philosophically critique Darwinism in the book, and I try to argue that, when you look back to figures like H.G. Wells, who was this committed Masonic socialist, a Marxist, committed, why is he the guy who's promoting, the new global revolution through science, through evolution? I mean, these people are committed liars, openly. So I think that's suggestive. I mean, I think you could argue nobody else has had the impact on science fiction and science fiction films by extension to the degree that H.G. Wells has.
Right. I'd agree with that. And I don't know if you've seen Stranger Things on Netflix, but
yes, I did a lengthy analysis of it. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Well, what's kind of interesting about that in this context is it invokes all those 80s sci-fi movies like E.T. and Close Encounters, but yet it's very clearly about this being this entity brought through a portal via MK Ultra torture. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. If anybody's interested, they can go to Jay's analysis, and I think there's an audio thing that I did and a pretty popular written piece that I did that, I don't know, got about 20 or 30,000 views on that. So it did really well. It's worth checking out.
Oh, yeah.
And what I argue is that it combines Kabbalism and it combines the idea of other dimensions, portals, all that stuff's kind of obvious. But what I found fascinating to begin with was that what sparked this in part was a lot of people in Hollywood wanting to play Dungeons and Dragons, believe it or not. There was an article that came out in, I don't know, MTV or Den of Geek or one of those pop culture sites that was talking about how The Rock plays D&D.
Weird.
So you were talking about The Rock earlier, and I'm not making too much out of that, but you wonder, like we were talking about with actors. Now, I understand that D&D is a game. I used to play D&D when I was in high school. I know all about how it works and all that, but isn't it interesting that, as you were saying earlier, with the idea of bringing down the gods or something, like what could it also be something where people believe that they are, really tapping into something?
Yeah.
And that's the thesis of, Stranger Things, is that they sort of unconsciously tap into this portal, this realm, through the D&D game.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not approaching this like a fundamentalist and saying that, if you play D&D, you're going to like open up the gate to hell and anything like that. But it does pose that interesting question of, can we meddle with and tap into forces that are beyond us that we don't understand?
Yeah, man. It's interesting. So what about, another movie, let's talk about The Goonies. Another Spielberg movie. Seems pretty simple and innocent enough on the surface, but there is more when you dig deeper, right?
Yeah, Goonies didn't make it into the book, but I wrote an analysis of it about a month ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just one that I'd always been, intending to get to, and I never really got to it until I was reading Fritz Springmeier's book. I read it like 10 years ago and kind of forgot about it, and I got that back out, and I was looking at that, and his chapter on the Astors made me think, now wait a minute, Goonies is about Astoria. So I read all of Fritz's chapter, which was fairly well sourced, and then watched Goonies again, and I, lo and behold, noticed a whole bunch of things I'd never ever noticed before. The first of which would be that when you look into the actual documented history of John Jacob Astor and the Astor family, all of that stuff is true. He was a high-level Freemason, Grand Master of a New York lodge. I believe he took his occultism seriously. But he was also a high-level drug trader. So that's all true. So the stories of him going from the fur trade to the drug trade through shipping, that's all true. And you can find the public documentation of all that, right?
Damn.
Which I linked in my article. So that was interesting. So I wasn't sure how to read that in light of Goonies. But then when I rewatched it, you notice that the Goonies are kind of going on this sort of national treasure Nick Cage type journey to decode the Masonic history of their city, of Astoria. And that's what they do. And they discover, actually, we're founded by a bunch of scallywag pirates. Now, so how is that relevant? Well, as we know from, people like Jordan Maxwell, I mean, the Jolly Roger flag is the flag of Skull and Bones because it's the flag of we're not bound by any of your laws. Mm-hmm. We're transnational. So when Skull and Bones and the OSS and these people took over that Jolly Roger symbol, they were saying, we are internationalists. We will run this drug trade outside of your national laws. We're not bound by any of your, stupid rules. We are the true elite outsiders. And so what's funny and ironic about Goonies is that the Goonies are going to have their houses all foreclosed on, and a country club is going to be built, golf course, right? And so they're the outsiders who actually discover the jewels, and then they're able to save the family and all that kind of stuff. So it's just ironic that they are the alienated outsider youth that identify with the pirates. When they decode the big Masonic myth of Astoria, they find the treasure, and they're able to, presumably they're wealthy, I guess, because he still ends up with jewels, like a bag of them, if you remember at the end. So anyway, I saw all that weirdness going on. that's how I read it. And there's also some weird kind of phallic references in Goonies, which I'm not sure what to make of, but
Yikes.
When we think about that in light of what Corey Feldman said, I don't know.
Absolutely. Something I was going to ask you about later on. It was Pizzagate, kind of, because child pedophilia in Hollywood has been a theme in conspiracy for a long time. Not only claims of passing around child actors, but also having underage kids play prostitutes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The political and Hollywood elite are very interrelated. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the Pizzagate scandal, or Hollywood's role in the abuse of children?
I think I did 3 or 4 audios on Pizzagate. So if anybody wants a fuller breakdown, they can check those out. But
sure.
But yeah, I think that it was pretty clear that there was some kind of black market operation going on that dealt with perhaps at least gay prostitutes or something like that. That's very popular in the DC scene, and that would also be connected to things like cocaine and drug use and all that, and code words and all that. So I know that I know all the arguments and everything about what all of the code words mean and all this kind of stuff, but I don't know if there's definitive proof. And, that could have been intentional. They could have put something out that wasn't definitively proven. But
Right.
what you can prove is, Laura Silsby did get in trouble for going to Haiti and trying to bring a bunch of kids out of Haiti. You can prove that. And
Yeah.
you can prove that she was connected to the Clinton Foundation. You can show that John Podesta made a lot of weird statements. And, what does it mean when they're talking about a hot tub? And yeah.
Pizza and a hot tub.
Yeah. So it's hard to say exactly definitively what it is. And,
right.
Was that a plan to Psy-Op the alternative media? I don't know. But ultimately, we don't need, quote, Pizzagate to know that this kind of stuff is true, because there's like a dozen other cases of the exact same thing.
Right.
So I'm not saying by admitting that I don't know exactly what the situation of Pizzagate is that it's not true. I'm just saying that I wouldn't be surprised, because there's so many other cases. We've got Savile, you've got the Dutroux affair in Belgium, you've got Franklin cover-up, Craig Spence, Johnny Gosch, the White House. There's a whole slew of other books that you could find about this kind of stuff. The Pedophilia in the Catholic Church, William Kennedy's book, Lucifer's Lodge, Malachi Martin's books have talked about it. There's just book after book after book that have already dealt with this matter.
Right. And I agree with you that you don't need Pizzagate. It's just kind of one example of a theme that seems to be there for sure. And a lot of times you can get a better beat on things by looking at the aftermath. And it wasn't really until that shooter went into Comet Pizza where I was like, oh, okay. So you put out a lot of smoke that's unprovable. You then do a false flag where a guy goes in with a gun. And then you say, okay, we got to crack down on these alternative news sites because conspiracy is dangerous now. It's not just goofy and wrong. It's actually dangerous to even discuss stuff that doesn't come from CNN, MSNBC. So I totally see that being a possibility for the agenda there.
Yeah. And I totally agree, like, as a thesis. You know what I mean? Like, I could see that thesis. I could also see the thesis that this was a real operation going on, with all the worst stuff imaginable.
Yeah.
but I just don't personally know. What we do know is that there's court cases involving Epstein and his island and all the Clinton trips on the Epstein pedophile plane and Little St. James. I mean that's known.
Of course, man. So we've talked about this idea that themes in film can give us an idea of what might be coming even a decade beforehand sometimes. Are there any newer film trends you see coming that concern you?
Yeah, let's see. I was trying to think of what sci-fi type things I've seen recently that hinted at that kind of stuff. Because, like I said, I think when you look back to something like AI or Minority Report, like in Minority Report, you're seeing targeted advertising and retinal scanning, all that kind of stuff that was new to 2001 or 2. All that kind of stuff we're seeing more prevalent now, right? And so in AI, you see sex bots. This is all in the news now, right? They're rolling out the sex bots. This was in Enemy of the State. It was in AI. It was in Blade Runner. Some of the replicants are sex bots. So I'm trying to think of recent sci-fi movies that I've seen that might have new aspects of predictive programming, but off the top of my head, actually, I can't right now.
Well, there's, the 2 new Star Wars movies. I guess we already talked about Arrival. I haven't seen all that many sci-fi movies in the past year or 2 either.
Yeah, and I think, as I said, like Arrival and Star Trek, and I mean, these kind of just have the more globalist-minded propaganda of anyone that's opposing. We mentioned Rand Corporation earlier. Rand Corporation had a direct connection to Star Trek. They were some of the Rand Corporation people were involved in brainstorming ideas and based on stuff that was in Star Trek. You can find papers on that at the Rand Corporation, so I'm not making that up. And what's the whole idea of Star Trek is we've got to have a federation that can rule all of these unruly, independent existing people groups. All right. I mean, that's just globalism 101. And Gene Roddenberry would actually talk about that openly. He would say, I'm all for global government. We got to have a new world order. This is the only way to do things. And, the way we do this is to get rid of all these people thinking that there's a God and that they have their own traditions. And that's all just got to be wiped away. And we'll have, the holodeck. Well, there you go. So holodeck and VR, that's what's coming.
Yeah. I was trying to think of other movies. I saw X-Men Apocalypse. I thought that was pretty interesting just because the Apocalypse character talks about being something ancient. Like there's a character who asks, "Who are you?" And he's like, "Elohim, Ra, I've been called many names over many lifetimes. I am born of death. I was there to spark and fan the flame of man's awakening, to spin the wheel of civilization. And when the forest would grow rank and needed clearing for new growth, I was there to set it ablaze." And I think that's a pretty awesome dialogue, but it's also pretty interesting.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because I have written on Avengers and the Marvel stuff, and X-Men is on my list to get to actually. But if you go and read my takes on Captain America and Avengers and all that, I think there's 3 or 4 articles I've done on those. It would be kind of the same themes because you got, like, if you saw X-Men First Class, that was crazy because they're like working with the CIA. They are a CIA project, which is just mind blowing. So all that's revealed, and I do think there's truth to this, the whole super soldier idea. And I have Chris Knowles' book; it's pretty good. So I'm glad you referenced him, but I just haven't seen Apocalypse yet. But I didn't know what to. I was lost actually in the last X-Men, the one before that where they went back in time, and like JFK era, and I'm like, what is going on here? They're interacting with Nixon and JFK and alternate timelines, and it just kind of lost me in the confusion, and I didn't think it was that great. But there is, you're absolutely right to point out X-Men and Marvel and all that because they're just rife with everything. I mean, all I can say is just check out my analyses on those movies at Jay's Analysis.
Yeah, and there were a lot of bombs when it comes to sci-fi in the last year. There was the remake of the sequel of Independence Day. There was that movie that I thought looked interesting, Gods of Egypt, that was apparently terrible.
Yeah.
So the only one I've heard that was good that I haven't seen is The Fifth Wave. I've heard that has some pretty interesting stuff in it because the first 4 waves are like, first they create, if there's an alien invasion and there's 5 waves of it, the first wave is create darkness, then widespread destruction, then infection, then invasion, and then the 5th wave is actually once the planet is in its weakened state, then you swoop in and just take it.
Interesting. Yeah, actually, I did see that movie advertised, but I didn't actually watch it. And the reason for that is that what I'm having to do right now is prep for the TV show that Jay Weidner and I are going to do. And we're working on the first season, and it's going to be 13 or 14 episodes of first Ridley Scott, then David Lynch movies, then Spielberg, then Kubrick, then The Matrix, then The X-Files, Christopher Nolan movies, James Cameron, Roland Polanski, Bond, Twin Peaks, True Detective, Godfather, Da Vinci Code. And then we're going to do an episode called Gnostic Cinema, which is Snowpiercer, Westworld, and Dark City. So what I'm having to do right now is, and this, I just got this information a couple days ago, so I don't even have the time really to watch the fun movies I'd want to. I have to sit and rewatch all of these over and over and kind of plot out what we want to do with each one of these episodes and where we want to take it. So that's what I've been working on, and our show will be, I think, running in April on Gaia TV.
Very cool. That's exciting. Well, right on, man. It's always great to talk to you. I enjoyed it last time. This has been a blast too. I like a guy who knows his shit, and you are one of those guys.
Thanks, Greg.
You got it. And before we close the books, let the good people know where they can further scratch the Jay Dyer itch if they do want some more.
Yeah, you can go to jaysanalysis.com, no apostrophe. And I think there's over 1,000 posts there. I've got over 600 or 700 articles I've written, 120 or 30 movie reviews. And you can find all that information there. I also do a podcast for the last year that's gotten pretty good traction now. You can find all the free hours. And then if you want to hear the full lectures, talks, interviews, I also do lectures on things like Tragedy and Hope or Plato's Republic. You can subscribe to Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or $60 a year. And if you want the book Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, there's a PayPal button there. And I do outside the U.S. and inside the U.S., and they are all signed copies. So I've got 25-star ratings on Amazon so far. The book's only been out a month, and it hit #1 in Amazon's film and Hollywood category. So
boom. And it is always best to get the books directly from the author if you can, to cut out that monolithic Amazon middleman, right?
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. It does help me out a lot if you order it direct from me. And I ship those out every day, so it doesn't take that long.
Right on. Well, awesome, man. Always a pleasure. I guess that brings us to the end of the show. Take care of yourself out there.
All right. Thank you, Greg.
You got it. All right, guys. Fun stuff. I really do like the Hollywood Breakdown guests because I've grown up being such a media junkie. And even though we all know it's a very persuasive tool, I think there are always new elements to discover. And I really think Jay is one of the best guys focusing on this area. I like Mark Devlin for music and Jay Dyer for movies, and I thought a lot of great stuff was covered today. Probably most memorable for me is that idea of E.T. being about a conjured-up spirit entity more than a space alien. It sort of strengthens the narrative of a concerted effort to put certain ideas into the culture about reality outside of our immediate environment and beings beyond it. An effort to depict magic, ritual, and entities, and paint it with the brush of science, space, and aliens. It's a curious case to make because you have to ask the why. Why would this be an agenda in Hollywood, with cooperation from NASA and military intelligence, and also a flooding of the alternative world with a bunch of space alien pushers too, if you think that's a part of it? Some do. It's very strange. Some would say it's because the elite were laying a base because they plan to stage a false flag alien invasion in the future. First you fight nations, like the 2 world wars. Then you fight ideas, like terrorism. And then you fight a completely fabricated enemy that you completely control with 100% autonomy. Maybe. People do say that, but I always found it to be a bit far-fetched. Now, if you're a flat earther, you already know why the directors are doing this. Obviously, they're crafting the space concept for the collective consciousness, projecting the futile possibility that we can actually rise beyond the dome that encapsulates this island Earth. A full-spectrum deception of the highest order, the lie of lies. Maybe. I'm also not a flat Earth guy, but I will meet you in the middle and say that I love the prison planet concept about as much as the hollow Earth, and you could fit this stuff in that box. Or it might be as simple as trying to expose the masses to occult entities and esoteric rituals and their Kabbalistic belief system on the DL, to Trojan horse the masses into the occult. Could be, but the lens of space and aliens does seem suspiciously significant, doesn't it? Maybe we'll never know exactly what motivates that machine, but I think it's pretty clear that those top directors, Spielberg, Kubrick, Cameron, they serve an important function. I can't claim to know what it is fully, and even James seems pretty flexible as to the whys, which is great because it's very arrogant to think we'll ever get it 100%. All we really can do is hold up different pieces, look them over, and see which ones fit better than others, which perspectives and threads weave a tighter tapestry to get us closer to the truth. But we're born into a completely different world, shaped by think tanks, wealthy industrialists, and international banking oligarchs who all have an interesting preoccupation with some occult belief system. Right? Right. Well, fucking A. Jay Dyer, if you like the stuff we talked about in the first hour, in the Plus show, we got into stuff like predictive programming in the Trump presidency, specifically in Back to the Future and Gremlins 2. And, you know, I was unaware that Jay had decided to throw his hat in Trump's ring, and I really don't care or judge him for it. It's just that everyone is so polarized now, listener-wise, that a lot of people are like keeping score with the guests, trying to make sure that their team is equally represented. Don't be like that. Some people are scoring me way to the right, and that is not fair because they're giving right-wing points for the Pizzagate shows. And that is an elite issue, not a right versus left one. I will not accept those points. And it's going to come up. It's coming up everywhere you look. But I'm spending less time on political topics and more on just the fringe, where we belong. But really, you shouldn't care about either political side, or at least you should be able to separate and appreciate a person's expertise and just sort of recognize their worldview, the lenses they look through. I mean, consider that in what they say, and then just see what you can pull out and apply to your own paradigm. It's not really about every little thing or writing someone off completely because they see one of about an infinite number of issues differently than you do, or they take religion more seriously than you do. You know how I am on religion, and I still have guests that hold it dear. If I think there's something I can appreciate about their work otherwise. But anyway, we talked about a lot of great stuff today in the second hour for those oh-so-supportive Plus people. G.I. Joe being a conspiratorial smorgasbord, touching on almost all the major themes we hear about in the alternative realm. Military recruitment films where you might least expect them. Dr. Strangelove as an allusion to the Rand Corporation. Esoteric Hollywood films shot on location at Rothschild mansions. Also why the Tavistock Institute would be studying Hitchcock films, the role of 70s and 80s dystopia films like Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal, the films of David Lynch, Jay's thoughts on more recent films like Split and Arrival. And as icing on this crazy cake, we talked about Chuck Palahniuk's work. I never know how to pronounce his name. I just take a shot. And Survivor, by the way. If you did hear the Plus show, Survivor is his book that involves a hijacked plane. I couldn't believe I couldn't think of it at the time. And we talked about a lot of other good stuff too. Just sign up for Plus already. For only $5 a month, this show is supported completely by the Plus program. I grew a pair and quit my shitty job managing a GameStop, built the Plus infrastructure, and never looked back. Guys, I try to be respectful of your time. give you a great show. And I offered up for just that $5, and I don't bother you with any other stuff. Yes, I make t-shirts based on episodes over at Higherside Clothing. But whatever. I hope you see the contrast between me and other hosts, the Higherside and other shows, and recognize even things like the difference in audio quality. I listened to a show the other day from a channel that I have been a fan of or a follower of way before THC was even a thing. One of the most well-known in the alternative realm, and the host, she still puts up her interviews on YouTube with the technical difficulties still in it, with terrible echoing throughout the entire show. It's just like, if doing interviews is what you're going to do for a living, take a goddamn second to get the audio right and package it up nice for the people before you put it out there. It's supposed to be your livelihood. So, again, whatever. If you like the show I do, if you think I do a good job, go to the HighersideChatsPlus.com and sign up. It's really easy. You can pay for 3, 6, or 12-month chunks if you don't like $5 a month. I have a robust, frequently asked questions section on how to get the Plus feed into your podcast players of choice if you're worried about that. Blah, 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 right? Well, it does mean a lot to be listener-supported, and every host is just trying to get your money somehow. But I wait to the end, and I like to think that I spend less time pitching than any other show, and I like the content to speak for itself. So meet me in the middle here. But again, Jay is always a welcomed guest, fun and knowledgeable guy to talk to, and I have 2 more shows due out by the end of the super short month of February, so I'm going to get on it. That is it for me. Your move, SoCal sorcerers of 8mm magic and mental manipulation. Your fucking move. Happy days are here again, people. From sunny San Diego, I'm Greg Carlwood. Welcome to the little show inside the big show, because when you really get down to it, so much of reality is crafted around us by culture creation occultists, like a bad Broadway play entitled How to Bring About the Apocalypse. And it seems like they have a version for every genre, flavor, and subset of reality, as the tyrannical think tanks take your mind wherever they want it to go. And as you probably know by now, most of this work is done through the arts and entertainment. Our guards are down, our brainwaves properly recalibrated, and our mind primed to accept the themes and ideas that the titans of Tinseltown deem worthy. But even beyond the manipulation of the masses, when you just look at Hollywood and those involved, it definitely seems to take its toll, as most of us know it as the epicenter of drugs, sexual abuse, and mind control with a painted-on smile. And when it comes to revealing 8mm magic and the ideas embedded in the arts, few can touch the work of today's returning guest, Jay Dyer. He runs jaysanalysis.com, one of the premier film and philosophy sites on the net. He's also the author of Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which did make it to #1 on Amazon in the film and Hollywood category. And today we're trying to make lightning strike twice as we gather around the digital campfire to talk about his sequel, Esoteric Hollywood 2, more sex, cults, and symbolism in film. So let's get into it. The real ritual revealer, the silver screen exposer, and the professor of motion picture propaganda, Jay, my man, welcome to THC number 3.
Holy shit, Greg! That was some based prose, man. Where's your prose? You need a man. That was some good prose, man. Serious.
I appreciate it, man. It's in the works. This year is just flying by, though, and I never seem to get that far down on my to-do list, which makes book number 2 for you all that much more impressive. And it's always great to talk to you. You know, as a pop culture and cinema junkie, I love these interviews that really get into the ideas and philosophy that are hidden behind all the razzle-dazzle. Mm-hmm. For people who might not remember, Esoteric Hollywood 1 sort of focuses on clusters of films categorized by director, Kubrick, Spielberg, Hitchcock, and of course, Ian Fleming and the Bond films as well.
Exactly.
And today we're going to get into Esoteric Hollywood 2. Tell us about the structure of this latest book and the places it goes that are different from the first.
Yeah, exactly. That was the main difference. I thought on the sophomore attempt, I needed to take things in a different direction and at the same time up my game while having some of the same flavor of part 1. So as you mentioned, we talked a lot about Kubrick in the first one, 100 pages of Kubrick, 100 pages of Spielberg, 80 stuff. And I was like, well, I can't just repeat that. I got to go in a new direction. So I decided to do it topically.
And what we started with was the mob. I thought, I can't believe I didn't touch on the mafia in relationship to Hollywood, which is a huge, huge factor in that whole scene over the last century. So I start there. I do include some cult stuff and some occult stuff in part 2. There's a heavy dose of that. But I also wanted to add more spy stuff and in relationship to how movies have portrayed, dialectics, be it the Cold War dialectic or the East-West Islam dialectic. And then I moved to the second section. After about 200 pages of that, we get into how Hollywood has pictured mind control with a selection of films. Originally, I was going to do every mind control film. I was like, I'm going to take a section and just do like a paragraph on every mind control film that I could find. But it turns out there's like a zillion of those. There are so many movies that dealt with the theme of MK Ultra and mind control. So I had to do a selection. And then the third section, I decided to talk about weather control, geoengineering, and how that might tie into the alien mythology and psychological warfare. And then, of course, the last section, you can't leave out Hollywood transhumanism.
No, you cannot. And that is a great summary. You do cover a lot of interesting material in here. Like you mentioned, you kick this thing off with the mafia and mobs in film. I wanted to get deeper into that. It's very interesting. I once did an interview with Brian Tahui, who wrote The Fix Is In, and he focuses on just how involved the mob is in the massive sports gambling industry. A little more obvious, but he also talks about how very few outcomes in sports are actually organic because of this mob control. But as you say in the book, they have also got their hands in Hollywood, right? Way more so than most people might think.
Yeah, there's some really crazy stories about the relationship of Hollywood to the mafia. And I think everybody's kind of familiar with the mainline mafia films that have kind of gone down in history as the greats, Goodfellas or The Godfather. And I wrote a fairly popular essay on The Godfather a few years ago. So I kind of spruced that up and added some more information because I came across recent stuff that a lot of people wouldn't know that, for example, the role of Al Pacino to play Michael Corleone, he actually had to get permission from the mafia to do that. They had somebody else in mind. So they had to make some deals, basically backroom deals in some casinos. This was actually decided in some casinos in Las Vegas. And that actually comes from a famous mob chronicler, Gus Russo, who has a famous book on the mafia, who describes this whole story. And the reason I bring that up is because, I think last time we might have touched on David Lynch and Twin Peaks and all that. Mm-hmm. And one of the analyses I did of David Lynch was Mulholland Drive. And you have that weird scene in Mulholland Drive where this sort of little midget dude behind a glass screen is deciding who gets what role. And, of course, the cowboy later on is this sort of supernatural figure who partly decides who gets that role in the film. So basically we have the mafia deciding who gets what role. So we have that in Mulholland Drive, and then I came across an actual example documented in the Gus Russo book. So I thought, I've got to include that and tie it into how, the Godfather trilogy really does portray how the world really works. That's why movies are so powerful in this way, is that the world is structured like global mafias basically running everything.
And it is so interesting because it's a lot like how the military must sign off on any film that's going to use all their toys in the storytelling. That's why they're all positive. And you wouldn't necessarily think you'd need the mob's permission to make a movie about them, but they're not shy about killing people. So it might be nice to get that endorsement.
Exactly. And since the time of the Cold War, the various mafias were pretty closely tied to the CIA. There was actually a series of deals that were made around the time of the JFK assassination, which actually does factor into the situation with JFK and what happened to him. I'm not saying it was only the mob. I'm just saying there is a mob and CIA background to that. And there's a documentary that a guy who's actually a screenplay writer who is working on a new mafia film, he sent me he said, hey, you need to watch this documentary. And it was about Sam Giancana, or they call Momo, the Chicago mobster. And it's just a mainline documentary on him, if you can find that Momo documentary. But it actually has a lot of connections that are made between the mafia and the JFK situation. And so you're absolutely right to talk about the approval of the intelligence agencies, but the intelligence agencies are locked at the hip, not just to Hollywood, but also to the mafia.
And kind of on this theme, if you've seen Ozarks, they use construction projects in that show as big drug money laundering operations because you can sink so much money into a project and it's hard to really qualify where it all went. A strategy I'm sure our president knows quite well. But
well, yeah.
Movie studios, they're kind of similar in that the budgets can be massive and sometimes you don't even need to produce a final product to make a couple $1 million sound reasonable. Talk to us a little bit about money laundering in Hollywood or this idea of studios as fronts, because there's a lot of history there, right?
There was. I had a film nerd friend who told me this many years ago. And when he first told me that, even though I was all into this Hollywood conspiracy stuff, even at the time, he said, a lot of these studios are money laundering. And I was like, what are you talking about? That's crazy. No, they're not. And sure enough, when I started researching just the topic of backdoor connections to Hollywood, that's what comes to the fore right away. In fact, there's a guy, Douglas Thompson, he wrote a whole book that touches on this, Dark Heart of Hollywood. And, he pointed out all these examples of situations where studios functioned as fronts. And I think one thing to understand is that it's not just one thing. Like a studio doesn't have to just be a front for money laundering. Like it can function in different things as different tools. I mean, they are also making money. It can be a way to stash money to avoid taxes. It can be a way to funnel operations. And it could even be a cover for a black op. In other words, a movie studio or movie crew could actually go and do something that is working for an ulterior purpose. And everybody knows this now. If you saw Argo, right now, that was the whole plot of Argo, was that this goofy sci-fi movie that was fake was an intelligence front. And that's all very real. But we've had many cases of people who've been convicted. Christopher Aberts was convicted of using his studio and screenwriting and all that as a front for money laundering. There have been cases where the FBI actually set up an independent film studio. They put out films, but this whole thing was just a front for various FBI surveillance operations. So there's a lot of examples of this. Even drug trafficking. There have been Hollywood directors and studios, and it starts to make sense, though. You could see why everybody kind of has a reverence for movie makers, right? And so if you show up in your Cessna and you're like, oh, I'm here to film a movie. Oh, you're with Hollywood. That's an easy cover, right? To like move drugs or even weapons or something like this.
Mm-hmm. And it really is genius because if someone were to tell you the budget of a film was $50 million versus $150 million,
yeah,
to the layman, I mean, that makes no difference, but that's $100 million difference. So it is kind of appealing to use it for that reason. And you have an example of Limelight. This is one I didn't know, but in 2006, they were busted as an ecstasy dealing and drug trafficking ring, and Charlie Chaplin's granddaughter was president of that company.
Yeah, that one was so crazy. I had to stick it in there. And yeah, and then I think after that, Douglas Thompson goes on to talk about other examples of mafia laundering. I think he says in one case $200 million through special effects extravaganzas. And then he goes on to talk about the $94 million budget for Tomb Raider involved some very fanciful arithmetic when they actually came down to what was made and what wasn't made. So yes, this is a huge thing. You start to wonder, well, if it's that crazy in these examples, it's probably crazy in other examples. Like what else is going on? Maybe something was going on with the Netflix series Narcos.
Mm-hmm.
This guy gets killed while he's scouting for locations. Again, I'm just speculating here, but we start to realize that all these worlds connect. When I did the first book, it was about sex cults, Hollywood, secret societies. Now we're starting to see, oh, wait a minute. Guess what? Cartels, they also factor into this. The mafia factors into this. And it's corporations, right? I mean, what is a movie studio? What are these giant studios but private corporations? So, again, all of these worlds intertwine and intersect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you're familiar with that classic B movie, The Room, but that's always been the speculation with that Tommy Wiseau guy.
Oh, hi, Greg.
Right, yeah. People call it, the worst movie ever made, right up there with Plan 9, but it had a $6 million budget, and it looks like it was filmed just in an abandoned house somewhere. It's still kind of a mystery where this weirdo got the money, and the big speculation is that he was connected.
That's a great point. Yeah, it happens in B movies for sure. I think, in fact, a lot of B movies. I did an interview with Mark Hackard a couple of years ago, and we were discussing movie studios as intelligence fronts. And he wrote an essay about a whole studio that was set up in the UK that was run by the Soviets back during the Cold War. And in that interview, we got to talking about a movie that starred Dolph Lundgren, Red Scorpion. That's the name of it. I think it's in the late 80s, maybe 1990, somewhere in there. Just this crappy kind of special operations dumb movie from 1990. But the movie appears to have been a kind of front for some intelligence operation. It was filmed somewhere where the CIA had, a particular interest at the time. And one of the reasons we know that is that the producer, I think it's the producer. I mean, I'm going from 2 years ago memory, but the producer was like Elliot Abrams from, Valerie Plame and Neocon fame. Why is Elliot Abrams the producer of this ridiculous Dolph Lundgren movie? And then come to find out other movies like, what's that movie about the guy who's the track star? It was popular in the 80s, and I can think of the theme song. Bum, 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 bum.
I think I skip most track star movies, tell you the truth.
I know I don't care about that shit either. This guy was like the Olympics guy, really famous Olympics guy. And I think the story is that he was he wouldn't run on Saturdays or Sundays for religious reasons. It was a big award-winning, movie in the 80s. Anyway, guess who was the producer on that? Dodi Fayed. So here we have like Dodi Fayed of, Princess Diana fame. And you start to realize, why are these people producers of movies? It's because they're involved in all of this stuff. And the movie studios are a big part of that.
Yeah, and it even filters into seemingly innocent things that you'll find in the realms of TV, like Cupcake Wars or Julia Childs. Apparently, she was connected in some regard. Why would somebody involved in a cooking show have a background in intelligence, or why would that be something that intelligence puts them into? Where's that connection getting made?
Yes, she was a member, of course, of the OSS, Julia Child was, and that's the nascent CIA. It's the predecessor of the CIA that the British intelligence set up for the U.S. It was actually Ian Fleming, of all people, William Stevenson, who came and on the part of the British Empire kind of negotiated with Bill Donovan in 1942 how to set up this version of what British intelligence had. And it was very successful. Again, it morphs into 1947, the CIA. So when you understand that this stuff is not about a lot of surveillance and spying per se, that's one little aspect of what intelligence stuff is. But a bigger part of it is culture creation. And that's much more important to the global planners, to the big elite, than just surveillance. Especially nowadays, with everybody willingly putting all their information online, that surveillance is less important than is culture creation. So that's what most people don't understand about the CIA and the OSS, is that it was about culture creation from the get-go. And when you look at it that way, well, food is a big part of culture, isn't it? Well, yeah. So that makes a perfect vehicle for a person to also be a spy or to be involved in that kind of an operation, because in many ways it can provide a cover. If you're going to all these different countries, maybe somebody like Bourdain, perhaps, they go to all these countries and their cover is, I'm here just to film my food show. By the way, I've got to go meet with, the president of this country for a certain reason, maybe. And then at the same time, food is culture. And so, I was reading a book that was talking about, from the globalist perspective, fast food was actually engineered for the purposes of getting people away from eating a family meal. So even though Julia Child might not have been, when she was in the OSS and then having her cooking show, she might not have been promoting fast food. What I'm getting at is that from the perspective of the intelligence agencies or the Pentagon or the social planners, you definitely want to control food. I mean, Bertrand Russell says diet is of the utmost importance for control on the part of the global elite.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, even though it's not something people think about often.
And by the way, the movie is Chariots of Fire. That's the famous 80s movie about the runner.
Oh, Chariots of Fire. Yes, I do know that title. And kind of on the themes we're talking about, if you've ever seen that movie Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, based on the book written by Chuck Barris. Now, I mean, obviously this is in the realm of comedy, but yes, sometimes there's truth in comedy. But he wrote that book about the idea that when he was the host on a show like The Dating Game, he's taken these contestants on international trips as a chaperone, and then he's also moonlighting with some kind of covert ops in that same kind of way. Love that movie. That was really the first one when I was younger that brought to mind the idea that, whoa, these could be giant cover operations.
Yeah, so this is a big George Clooney film. I think he's connected to the production company that made Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, if I recall.
Yeah, he did direct it. I was unaware of that.
Exactly. Yeah. And so Clooney, my suspicion about that is that Clooney himself is most likely worked for the CIA. I mean, when you get to that level, you've got Angelina Jolie being directly involved in the CFR. I think it's very reasonable, given Clooney's history and his activities, that he's probably involved in that as well. Ben Affleck's pretty open about it. Like, he talks about, Hollywood's full of CIA. So I think maybe Clooney was making that movie because he related to it a little bit. I'm not saying he's an assassin.
Right.
That from that vantage point where Clooney's at in terms of mega A-lister, global star, he can understand, and he's telegraphing to us exactly, how the world really works, how it's not like you think. Even actors are not always what you think. Many of them have been spies, all the way back to Errol Flynn, all the way back to some of the biggest stars, even under Stalin. One of the top actresses of the Soviet Union, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but she was Stalin's right-hand spy woman. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and it also could be an example of this thing where they take a template for something very real and they make it a silly example, like Chuck Barris in The Dating Game. And then when people hear about it as a reality, they're like, oh, well, that's that bullshit we saw in that movie. There's no way that kind of thing is true. They just kind of take the air out of the idea, even though it might be a legitimate thing that happens in other cases outside of the one where they're making a joke out of it.
It does have that, disarming kind of, can throw you for a loop initially when you start to see it in reality and you've been conditioned to it. That really, I think, is the main point of predictive programming. What you're talking about definitely plays into that, because on a subconscious level, and it actually has been studied on a subconscious level. They studied Hitchcock films on a subconscious level to see how it affected the audience back when he premiered Psycho. So they've been at this for a long time. And so they're definitely aware of how a person perceiving something as fiction can alter their perception when it becomes reality. That's, again, a big part of how you condition people. We can talk about the esoteric element to predictive programming. I think it is there. I think a lot of the people who are involved in predictive programming do have esoteric type worldviews, but just on a practical level functions very well to kind of gaslight people and prep them for events that come in the future. So I think you're right to stick to the practical purpose of why it's done.
And so let's get into probably the biggest film franchise about the mafia. Let's talk about The Godfather. You spent a lot of time on it in the book. What might people not know about it? Or what about this trilogy do you see as agenda-driven?
Well, there's a lot of different layers to it. I think when Mario Puzo wrote his novel, he actually interviewed a whole bunch of living dons. So the book is a mix of the perspective of a lot of different mobsters. So it's not just one guy, but it is essentially the Sicilian mafia. But again, he had to get permission not just from the Italian dons, but he also had to get permission from the Jewish mafia to do the movie the way that he did. And that's covered in Gus Russo's book. But the aspect that most people don't realize is that as the trilogy progresses, there's actually more revelation as it moves into parts 2 and 3 about the real world. Now, most critics obviously prefer part 1. Part 2 is still considered a great film. A lot of people are kind of down on part 3, but actually, again, by the time of part 3, you're getting some pretty heavy doses of secret society, backdoor, P2 type stuff that relates to Gladio. So if you're familiar with Operation Gladio, this was the stay-behind networks that the CIA and NATO had in place in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And this was, of course, supposedly so that the Soviets, communists, wouldn't take over Europe. So what they had was these cell networks that basically were terrorists. And they, again, were black ops guys, and they were recruited as paramilitary out of the Italian fascist lodges in Italy, the Grand Orient fascist lodges called P2. So they would do terror operations. They would do all kinds of crazy stuff, false flag type stuff to blame the commies and the Soviets. This actually plays into part 3, and most people don't catch that because the Andy Garcia character, when Michael Corleone is being taken down, and the figure who plays Pope John Paul I in the movie, when they're being taken down, Andy Garcia says, this is P2, right? And it's a very sort of brief kind of off the cuff thing that Andy Garcia says, because he's, if you don't recall, he's taking over from Michael Corleone. He's the next Don for the family. And what we see is really the downfall of the family there, because Michael has moved into international relations. He's taken his front, and actually in part 3, he creates an NGO. He creates a tax-free foundation that's involved in land deals. So he's moved from the big time. He's not just a small-time family mobster in New York. He's actually moved into global operations. And this is, again, telling for how the world really works and how it ties into not just secret societies and intelligence operations like P2 or Gladio, but actually how it ties into international banking, NGOs, and think tanks.
Right. I actually love that about it. And maybe it didn't come across as entertaining. Maybe it's a little drier, but that is kind of the path. And I like that the third one goes into that. And in that section of your book, you talk a lot about the Catholic Church, of course.
Yes, right.
And I know you are an Orthodox Christian, but you know a lot about the geopolitics of the Vatican.
Mm-hmm.
And you say the co-opting of the Vatican is much earlier than the Vatican II conspiracy most Catholics adhere to. Can you break that down for us a bit? What is the conventional conspiracy, and what would you point to that leads you to think that it was actually co-opted even before that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Basically, the traditional conspiracy, you could say, is that by the time of Vatican II, a whole bunch of Freemasons, Satanists, Illuminists, and all manner of nefarious groups had made their way into the Vatican and into the power structure. They had captured a lot of the cardinals. People will typically point to Cardinal Rampolla, who around the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, was actually in the OTO. And the story is at least that Cardinal Rampolla almost was made Pope at that time. His election was actually blocked, though, by, I think, the Hungarian emperor at the time. So this line of reasoning says that, well, what happened at Vatican II was that they essentially came out of the closet with their victorious control of the office of the papacy. And so ever since that time, you've had this commandeering, which is turning the Vatican into a global network for the promotion of an apostate kind of new world religion. That's the conventional conspiracy on what happened in the 20th century to the Roman Catholic Church. But there's a deeper picture here that most people aren't aware of, and this has really been detailed in an academic way by a traditional Catholic himself named David Wimhoff, who has put out a book about John Courtney Murray and the subversion of the church. And what he shows is that it's not really a conglomeration of Masons per se. There is a Masonic element to the subversion of the Catholic Church, but the real power structure that was able to subvert the Catholic Church in the 20th century was the CIA. And they did this through the auspices of the Cold War. And when I read that, it really resonated with a lot of things I'd read in the past about how John Paul II actually had weekly meetings, I think it was weekly, with William Colby. And they were talking about how to break down the wall, how to engineer the convergence between Eastern Soviet bloc communism and Western capitalism. And so there was a meeting at Malta in, I think, 1988 between Bush Sr., John Paul II, and Gorbachev. And this really signified the fall of the Soviet Union. And then, of course, everybody knows about the bankers kind of coming in and raping Russia after this. Again, all engineered by Western intelligence, by the Harvard boys, Larry Summers, the Clinton crew, and all that. That's who was behind the raping of Russia in the 90s. But it was preceded by this operation of these meetings between Bush Sr. and Gorbachev and John Paul II. So I think it's very easily demonstrable that it's not just theological ideology that drove the events of Vatican II. And on top of that, you can go back further. I think Hoffman has documented in his book, Occult Renaissance Church of Rome, that the subversion on the part of the Roman Catholic Church can extend all the way back to the Renaissance. Because you had these really corrupt Borgia popes, which everybody kind of knows about. They've been making like Showtime and HBO shows about these Borgia popes, and they would castrate boys back then to sing in their choir. The Pope had his like private choir of castrated choir boys, which I mean, to me is completely psychotic. But
Yikes.
But when you start to think about it like that, it's like, well, now wait a minute, maybe this kind of corruption didn't just begin with recent Vatican II liberal development in the Roman Catholic Church. Maybe this goes back 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, they say Michael Jackson's dad had him chemically castrated so he would keep his
Yeah,
voice. I mean, you
right.
got to keep that money train going. If you got a golden goose laying golden eggs, and I guess you just disintegrate their genitals with chemicals and keep it going.
Yeah, right. Also, too, the banking side of it, too. I mean, everybody kind of has, especially if you're in the conspiracy world, you've heard a little bit about the Banco d'Ambrosia, perhaps, and the Vatican bank scandal, where certain bankers ended up hanging in a Masonic pose upside down from a bridge, Blackfriars Bridge. This is a famous ritual murder that related directly to the assassination of John Paul, and I do think he was assassinated. The assassination of John Paul I after 33 days of being Pope. I don't think that's accidental that he was Pope for 33 days and then was assassinated. But that's also in Godfather 3. In fact, the character Roberto Calvi is pictured in the film. You see him assassinated. And real world assassination here, this guy actually was hanging upside. I think it was in the death pose. You know, if you're familiar with the tarot card of the death pose with the guy's leg hanging down, that's how he was hanging, if I recall. So that was definitely a hit. It was probably a P2 hit and pretty well known. But the Vatican bank scandal shows us that, guess what? The Vatican bank wasn't just a problem that popped into existence in the 20th century. By public admission, the Rothschilds have been running the Vatican bank all the way back to the 1700s. And I don't think it just begins with the Rothschilds. I think you can go back, again, you go back to these Borgia popes. I mean, there was tremendous corruption back then, and everybody knows about it.
So interesting. And something I didn't expect to see in the book was a breakdown of your thoughts on the Marian apparition event, Our Lady of Fatima. You got a pretty interesting take on that. How do you interpret that saga?
I came to this conclusion because I did for many years go to a traditional Catholic church. So I was kind of in that mindset. I know what it's like to be locked into that box and to read everything from that limited perspective. And one of the things, of course, that they will always point to is this great, vast miracle, supposedly of Fatima. And I thought it was appropriate to stick it in there just because it ties in so clearly to the Cold War. Again, I mean, I know that Fatima precedes the Cold War, but what happens to the Roman Catholic Church, as Wemhoff points out in his book, John Courtney Murray, and the CIA and the doctrinal warfare program that took over the Catholic Church is essentially what his book is about. John Courtney Murray is one of the famous theologians present at Vatican II, but what happens is the Catholic Church becomes a tool of Americanism and the CIA to promote American ideas, which are then supposedly identified with the Roman Catholic Church across the globe. It literally becomes this engine to promote this stuff. And even though a lot of people were sincere, they thought, oh, yes, we got to fight the godless Soviet Empire. And I'm not saying that the Soviets were good. I think it's, again, a dialectic at work here. What happens is that they start churning out movies. Catholic movies get churned out all throughout this period. And we have to go back to Fatima because when Mary supposedly appears at Fatima and gives this warning of the prediction of World War I think it's curious that her explanation of why Russia has to be stopped is because of the errors of communism that are going to be promoted from Russia, is what the apparition supposedly says. But she doesn't mention that Russia's errors come from England. It's the Atlanticist power bloc that exports the bankers in England. And that's who exports Marxism to Russia, from London to Russia. So when that's exported, Mary just forgot to mention this. But what we see is that this is a targeted apparition that specifically makes Russia into the bad guy. And surprise, surprise, the two chief enemies of the Western Empire, the Atlanticist Empire of the 20th century, are Russia and Germany. So it just happens to be the case that the apparition targets one of the two chief enemies of the Western elite power structure. No, I think it's engineered, and it was engineered for geostrategic purposes. It fits perfectly into the Great Game. That's exactly what the Great Game is about, getting rid of Russia. So that's my take on Fatima. And I found CIA discussions where in famous books, Victor Marchetti's book, they talk about how to stage apparitions to mobilize the local populations for the purpose of geopolitical ends.
Yeah, it's not unprecedented for intelligence agencies to lean into superstitions and the supernatural.
Right.
And when you think about the content of the message being so wrapped up in geopolitics, it's hard to see it as genuine. But I guess I still think about the technology. I mean, we're talking about blue beam stuff. Everybody's like worried about, oh, they might use blue beam to stage some big event. Well, they clearly have been able to make things look supernatural at a time depth in which I would think the technology wouldn't really be there to make it seem viable, but clearly they got something. They're doing something. I don't know if it's just smoke machines and a flashy costume, but it's convincing to some people.
Well, if you know, I'm not trying to be too much of a Reddit skeptic type of dude, but I will say that if you know when a stellar conjunction or some sort of stellar phenomenon is coming, I mean, we know an ancient priest knew when there would be strange stellar phenomena just on the basis of calendars, right? There would be a conjunction, there would be
like an eclipse or something even.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you knew that that was coming, then you could quite easily dupe a bunch of Portuguese villagers and simpletons, in other words. So I think that that's a possibility. And another possibility, too, is that the news story is just made up. Like they just created the news story in the local papers, and either there wasn't this phenomenon or they duped a bunch of villagers. Or, like you said, it is possible that there was some kind of weird phenomenon that we don't know about. But even that doesn't necessarily mean that that vindicates Roman Catholicism. Maybe there was a phenomenon that happened, and maybe some villagers decided, hey, I can get famous from this, and let me Mary talk to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or again, it was a geostrategic thing, and the bankers had already planned to have World War One, and so they needed a kind of apparition to mobilize large forces of the Catholic perception. And if you think that seems a little strange, let me remind you that H.G. Wells, when he did Shape of Things to Come, this is actually 4 or 5 years prior to World War II, and he predicts exactly what would happen, all the bombing campaigns, all the crazy stuff that would happen in World War II, a lot of which didn't exist yet. Like a lot of the ideas of, I mean, nobody would have believed that there would be this giant world war with big bombing campaigns. Now, did he predict it, or did he know that the bankers had planned World War II? I think he knew that they had planned it. And I think it's reasonable to suspect that this is what was going on at Fatima as well.
Yeah, it's a take I hadn't heard, but I've heard that template applied to other situations, so I don't think it's completely unreasonable. And something I kind of expected to see in a book about Hollywood, sex, and cults, but didn't really, is the NXIVM cult stuff with Keith Raniere and Allison Mack. I know you've done some videos about it, but that is a crazy template and an example of something that's probably a lot deeper. What have you seen when you looked into that case? I mean, is it basically just another template for the kind of stuff that is there but doesn't bubble up to the surface very often?
I think you're right. It would have been ideal if that information had come out when I wrote the first one. I mean, it would have been perfect. It should have had its own chapter. And I could have stuck it in part 2, but the problem is that I already had pretty much the manuscript and all that to the publisher before the meat of the NXIVM stuff came out. So right when the NXIVM stuff was starting to make headlines, the manuscript was done, and then it was a little bit too late to add that stuff. But you're right. I wish that I had put it in there because it really is a vindication of a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about. It goes up to the highest levels of the global elite in terms of the Bronfman dynasty. You've got it connected to all these NGOs, the Clinton Global Initiative people involved in it, a lot of other corporation connected people, Fortune 500 types. And it seems to have a global stretch. And it functioned like a weird Amway type of thing, like a pyramid scheme mixed with a sex cult, mixed with brainwashing, and now other stuff's coming out, like Raniere guy supposedly was trafficking child porn type stuff too. So presumably human trafficking is involved. I'm not positive that's been substantiated yet, but presumably that's there. And then most recently in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the John of God cult come to the fore. He's reportedly involved in a lot of not just abuse, but perhaps even baby farming. The girl who pointed this out mysteriously ends up suicided. I think that's suspicious.
Wow.
And also connected to the same circles of NXIVM. I'm not saying John of God wasn't in NXIVM, but a lot of the same high-powered people running in the same circles as NXIVM. So you're absolutely right. It ties directly into Hollywood with Allison Mack and all that. And I just see it as a vindication, and I wish that I had included it in part 2, but it was too soon.
Well, fuel for the trilogy.
Exactly.
And I'm not exactly familiar with, did you say John of God?
Yeah, there was a big cult bust in Brazil, I think, or Peru, maybe it was Peru, but it's been some weeks now. It's kind of out of the news, but it was a big news story maybe 3 weeks ago. And this was a weirdo New Age faith healer guy, surprise, surprise, who sits under a giant pyramid. Nothing suspicious there. Maybe if a guy's sitting under a giant pyramid, there's a little, something shady going on. But a lot of people had made these pilgrimages to him. A lot of kind of the New Age crowd that wanted healing and to raise their vibrations and consciousness, that kind of stuff. And turns out this guy had abused, and the accusations are rape, countless women.
Wow.
Then it came out that one of, I think it was not just his daughter was accusing him of abusing her, but another woman who was involved in the group said that it's worse. They actually are involved in human trafficking, and they have breeders. Now, if you're familiar with the satanic ritual abuse phenomenon, this has been bantered about for a long time, the idea of breeders, kind of viewed as still fringe, I guess you could say. So the woman who made the accusation that he was running a baby farm, everybody kind of took that as tabloidy. Well, she actually ends up dead a few days later. And this is mainstream news. This is not conspiracy sites. Totally mainstream news. She ended up in Spain, I think, and had been suicided. Immediately after making the public accusation that he was running a baby farm. And the John of God character himself was affiliated with Oprah and all these, really high level international type people. And Oprah immediately released a statement like, sorry, I promoted this guy a couple years ago. Sorry, I promoted him. We disassociate. Oops, my bad.
Yeah, well, I mean, how many times do we see orphanages connected to child abuse? And there was just that scandal about the Catholic Church and these priests banging the nuns, and then they'd chain the nuns up during their pregnancy, and then who knows what they do with that baby afterwards. But
exactly,
dark stuff.
I would say the breeder thing is real.
Yeah,
I would venture to say this. So.
I would say so too. I mean, there are people who will make money off anything, and it's unfortunate that human beings are a commodity to people in that world. And so if you can make them out of thin air by abusing just a few women, some people are going to do it.
Yeah, even one of the big battle rappers, I don't know if you're familiar with Daylight, but he's a fairly popular battle rap guy. He made a pretty wild video where he talks about how, for certain reasons, he wanted to get on the dark web some years ago to download something. He said he was trying to buy a silencer for a gun that he had. And he says he came across some of these rooms where they do this kind of hostile style torture type stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I've never looked at any of that, or I don't have any interest in that. But the point is that he was making the argument that a lot of that kind of human trafficking type stuff that you hear about, he was saying it's real. Unless this was some high, super technical stage thing that was all fake, he's like, it looked real to me. And that would involve trafficking.
I don't doubt it. I've watched some videos that act as guides to the deep web, because I'm not willing to actually go mess around there, but I am curious. And the darkest thing I had seen was a guy pulls up this website where they say, it's somewhere in some third world country. It's just a bunch of jail cells, basically.
Right.
And they say, we will do any science that you want. Do you want to know the effects of aluminum in high doses on pregnant women? We'll get you that data. Wow. Do you want to know, this, that, and the other? And so you don't ask any questions. You just say, yeah, I want to know this chemical, this condition, what it does to people, and they'll tell you. And that is scary stuff.
Yeah, and there was the story of the cannibal, too. So even cannibalism comes into this it usually makes it into everybody's top 10 dark web stories. I don't know if you've ever seen.
No.
My name is Chills, and I'm going to show you the top 10 dark web stories. I hope that you don't get scared. He's one of these top 10 type channel guys. But in one of his dark web videos, he talks about the cannibal case in one of the Nordic countries. But the guy was actually literally a cannibal, and he found a service on the dark web for meeting up with other cannibals. And the weird part of that story was the guy ended up getting convicted. I can't remember. He's got a weird Nordic type name, but he found a guy who wanted to be eaten. That was his fantasy. It was a gay guy who wanted to make love and then literally be cooked and eaten. And the cannibal obliged him.
Jeez, I guess he was like a praying mantis in a previous life or something.
There you go, right? So and the dude ended up convicted, but that's one of the kind of the more famous dark web stories.
Man.
Oh, by the way, let me add real quick. Many years ago, I turned up because I heard about that story a long time ago, and I remember researching it. I cannot dig up again where I located it, but I do recall a pretty sourced document on that case, well sourced, that actually argued that the cannibal guy was actively involved in one of the sort of the darker occult groups. And they had a pretty solid case for that. I can't dig up again where it was, but I do think that's also possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man, a lot of crazy stuff going on out there. And that NXIVM cult I always use that as an example now. I'm waiting for some books to start coming out that are just focused on that because it checks all the boxes. I mean, he's tricking young girls into making porn for a private collection.
Mm-hmm.
He's using branding, psychological torture, sleep deprivation. These slaves apparently were blackmailed into providing new collateral, sometimes as often as every month, whether it's porn or signing over assets or some kind of thing that the group could use to end their career if it took off. It kind of reminds me of Scientology because they're very much about that confession element. You've got like a handler who you're supposed to tell everything to, and then of course it's used when you want to try to get out.
Exactly.
And you can't. But what's crazy about NXIVM is it says, like, all the articles I can find say that it's funded by wealthy donors. And you mentioned a couple of organizations, the Clinton Foundation tangentially might be connected, but I still don't know really where all that money is coming from. Who's really funding something like the NXIVM cult? Hopefully it comes out in court.
They already arraigned Claire Bronfman.
I
mean, that was like big news when it first broke. She made her bail, but I don't know if the court date has gone through yet, but she's had her trial. But the accusation was that the money came from the Bronfman dynasty. That's the Seagrams. So Seagram's alcohol.
Oh, okay.
That's the Canadian mega billionaire family, the Bronfmans. They're also bought into media. So they're one of the big elite families. And that's reportedly, at least, according to just mainstream news, where the money came from for the cult.
Wow. So to get back to your book, let me ask you about V for Vendetta, because it's a film that I love. I even named my cat Evie, but you are pretty hard on it. You write, Alan Moore is undoubtedly a talented artist and storyteller, but the notion that V for Vendetta is a story geared towards human liberation, as masses of ignorant fans assume, is laughable. And of course, Anonymous and Occupy and all that stuff came after and was very politicized, and it was sort of a commercialization of rebellion. I get all that. But how is the film itself not about liberation?
I mean, I've watched a lot of interviews with Alan Moore, and I don't doubt that he personally thinks he's on a process of self-liberation. I'm sure he intended the meaning of the story to be liberation. But I want to highlight the reason I tied it into like anarchism is because I am critical of anarchism. I see it as a tool. Again, I'm not talking about the sincerity of individuals or the artists who put it out. They may be completely sincere in terms of seeking and wanting liberation. But what I wanted to illustrate was that anarchism or anarcho-terrorism is and has historically been used in a dialectic or even a trialectic. I mean, if you look at the history of the British Empire, they were some of the first to utilize anarchism as a means of staging stuff. For example, when I talked a minute ago about Gladio and the Cold War, just because Operation Gladio and the NATO stay behind people staged and blame things on the communists, in my view, that doesn't make communism good just because that was part of this big kind of dialectic. And it's not like there's only two options of like, well, are you a Western capitalist or are you an Eastern collectivist communist? There's also anarcho-terror type stuff. And I view that as typically having been used as well. And I don't think that the system is going to allow artworks out that promote the kind of anarcho, cyberpunk, I'm the true rebel type of view that's not going to try to co-opt it into an aspect of the system that is still useful to the system. So what I'm trying to say is I want to separate the individual artist's intention, which that may have been to do that. It's kind of like with Kubrick. Was Kubrick part of the system? Was he really trying to tell people how evil it was? Well, I mean, you could argue that point. But what I was interested in was just the approach of the film itself in terms of its commercialization. I mean, you've got Hot Topic used to have Guy Fawkes masks, right? I mean, that's like, is punk music really punk if it's everywhere in Hot Topic? And I see those things as establishment stamped of approval, rebellion movements. And again, there are people, it's like Dave McGowan's thesis on the Laurel Canyon scene. A lot of the artists were genuinely anti-war. But if you don't have a foundation or a perspective from which to actually critique why war is wrong, a philosophy, if you don't have a grounding to be able to do that, if you just have this, whatever you believe is true, man, whatever I believe, like that just relativistic type of view is itself problematic. It doesn't work. So I think you need to be better grounded. And that's what I was going for in the critique.
Right on. I mean, that is a great point. When I was in high school and I was a punk kid complaining about the bullshit of the Gap and Abercrombie,
right.
And then somebody told me that the same company owns at least a couple of these different stores, and I was just like, those motherfuckers, they got me.
Yeah.
But let's talk about anarchism a little bit more, because you do say, I have the quote here in the book, you say, you consider anarchy being the worldview par excellence of the elite because it's the most destructive, and you say ultimate liberty is really absolute slavery to the passions. And I sort of see what you're getting at, the whole overindulgence, Satanism, do what thou wilt stuff.
Right.
But I look at something like the drug war, right? Personally, I think all drugs should be legal. I think you should have the freedom to fuck yourself up if you so choose. But if the state were to give me the freedom to do heroin legally, it doesn't mean I have to indulge, right? So that's kind of where I bring in that personal responsibility. I think we should have ultimate liberty, but that doesn't mean that you must have ultimate indulgence.
That's true. This gets into a question of complex issues of the role of the state and the role of private corporations. And I think you're right to say that, 100 years ago, you could walk into an apothecary and you could simply buy opiates or you could buy cocaine. I don't necessarily have a problem with the free sale of those things. The problem is that we're in a situation now where society has been degenerated on purpose. So one of the problems with that perspective of just kind of the basic sort of libertarian approach is that it misses the fact of culture creation and toxic culture. So the corporations can buy the government off, and then they can, through the government, kind of channel everybody into things that destroy and denigrate culture. Then when the culture is denigrated and collapsed, they can make all this stuff freely available. This is what you see in Brave New World, where drugs are basically mass available to the population because they've lost the ability to have self-control. So I would agree with you in principle. I mean, I do think THC has all kinds of positive healing benefits. It should be available in its organic way. It would do a lot better for people than all these SSRIs and this big pharma crap. So I'm totally pro THC in terms of its healing properties. But I'm just saying it's a little more complex when we factor in the issues of social engineering and the role of the corporate state in intentionally trying to make things legal at a stage. And again, I'm not saying that THC should be illegal. What I'm saying is that when you've denigrated a culture to the point where people don't have self-control, then you can flood them like with the opiates, right? Like the OxyContin being made available to the middle Americans, to people in the South. It's the same model that the CIA did with targeting the ghetto with crack cocaine. And I think this is all done on purpose. I think they flooded the South, the rednecks, with meth, just like they flooded blacks with crack. That doesn't mean that the drug war is true and good and we should have, the bad guys running the drug war. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's really complex when you start looking at it from all these different vantage points. And I'm not saying that because they flooded the ghetto with crack, that we should therefore not have restrictions or have complete availability of all these things. Because again, they didn't flood the ghetto with crack until they had broken down the morals of blacks in America. Mm-hmm. And they did that through toxic culture. Then they could destroy and damage the people group more easily through something like crack. And I'm blaming the establishment. I'm saying it's the corporate government that did that intentionally. So in principle, I agree with you that if we were in a situation where society was a little more self-controlled, it wouldn't be a problem for people to go down to the apothecary and buy cocaine if they needed it for something, or to buy THC if they needed it for something. It's just a big giant mess is all I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. And just to put a cherry on top of this whole thing, obviously you write about a lot of great stuff in this book, but a book takes a long time to write. Let me ask you, what is the most recently released film that you've seen that you think needs to be properly mined for the type of content you cover, even if you haven't got to it at the depths that you normally would?
Probably Panos Cosmatos, I guess, with Mandy and Beyond the Black Rainbow. Now, I had seen Beyond the Black Rainbow when it came out. I knew about MKUltra and that kind of stuff when it came out, but I was still kind of a noob when it came to tying it to some of the deeper stuff. And the style of the movie was so overbearing. It's almost like he's wanting to put you through a mind control experiment. So I held off on it, but I went back last week and I watched Beyond the Black Rainbow, and I thought it was excellent. It was a great film. I really appreciate it now. And I think I needed to see Mandy first. And that kind of initiated me properly to Panos's movies and his style. And so then when I went back and watched Beyond the Black Rainbow, it was a lot more powerful. So I would say Mandy and Beyond the Black Rainbow.
Right on. That's one I hadn't even heard of. And man, so Jay, just always a pleasure. I think you do great film analysis. I'm always learning something. Before we go, remind the people where to get the books, where to see you online, and all the good stuff you got going on.
Yeah, you can just go to Jay's Analysis and jaysanalysis.com. You can find the shop there for the books. You can find the subscription there for the archives and the interviews and talks that I've done on the Globalist books and all that. Full access, $4.95 a month, $60 a year. You can also watch the TV show that we did with Jay Widener, one whole season. If you subscribe to Gaia, there's links there for that. And the advantage, of course, I sign all the books, so you get a signed copy. If you get it from Amazon, it's not very good for the author. I also do tutoring. That's picked up quite a bit. So I tutor quite a few people in philosophy. So if you're interested in learning philosophy and all that stuff, you can sign up for tutoring at the Patreon there. And then my YouTube has grown a good bit. So if you would subscribe to, I'm doing a lot more video content nowadays. So you can subscribe to my YouTube channel there.
Awesome. And yeah, congrats on Hollywood Decoded with Jay Wiedner.
Thanks.
You also have another pilot out there right now too, don't you?
Well, you know about that maybe as well. I don't know what. Yeah, it's in the works, being shopped around. So hopefully, cross our fingers, maybe somebody will buy that.
Yes, I am also in that. And I don't know, are we allowed to talk about that? I know I didn't sign anything.
There was an NDA, but I think you can say that it's out there, but I think we're just not supposed to say like a whole lot of details or anything.
Fair. All right. Well, man, again, it has been a huge pleasure. Best of luck out there and keep doing what you do.
Okay, man. Thank you. Have a pleasure to talk to you again, and I really appreciate having me on.
Cheers.
All right, later, dude.
Hallelujah, dear listeners. Hallelujah indeed. Another one in the can, kicking off April with a great returning guest, Jay Dyer. Big thanks. I feel like THC has really built some solid bench strength over the years when it comes to guests who come back every so often and cover a new round of media in their particular lane. We got great music guys like Mark Devlin, also great movie guys. Obviously, Jay is one of those great movie guys. Probably my favorite. His impressions work really great for podcasts too. But obviously today, especially if you heard the second hour, the ideological differences between us were maybe a little more obvious. I wouldn't even really call them differences because Jay is an Orthodox Christian and I haven't really planted my flag anywhere at this point, and I won't. Call me a chaos ideologist. I like to pull things from wherever that I think seem to work for me because I don't really like any of the boxes I've seen enough to hop in. But I did have some questions about Jay's ideology, of course. And after the show, we were actually talking, and I asked him if he was familiar with Miguel Connor, because I would actually be pretty interested to hear Jay and Miguel sort of debate or rigorously discuss those two perspectives, the Orthodox Christian perspective versus Gnosticism. I'm not the guy to do it, but I think it would be a really fun thing to listen to. And he said, funny enough, I was just on with Miguel. And so I haven't checked it out yet to see if it aired, but I'm looking forward to hearing Jay on Aeon Byte talking about those differences potentially. And that's really saying something because I'm honestly exhausted by the ideological and philosophical and political debates that are happening across podcasting. The Ben Shapiros and Steven Crowders and even Jordan Peterson at this point. I do think it's ultimately good to have a greater depth to discussion as we drift towards the idiocracy age. But sometimes it's like, guys, who gives a shit? Just have some fun, be a good person, and enjoy your life. I mean, maybe that is what they enjoy. Obviously, they do. But regardless, I think Jay is a really good communicator and common ground finder. But even as he said, some of the things that I associate as positive aspects of a Gnostic perspective, he also considers those same things positive and also principles of his ideology. But on some of those things, I think it's good that we got into it. And it's good to know that we do kind of agree. And I'm glad we agree. And that is that. But in terms of content for this show, great start too with Mob Money and studios as front companies. That's the sort of stuff that I think is really juicy. Of course, that's where his book goes. So I knew that that's where this was going to go too. But it's fun off the radar stuff. In Higherside news, people always ask, how do I know when the joint sessions are? Well, they are always on either the 20th or the 25th of the month at 7 p.m. Pacific time. And it's in these wrap-ups when I let you know which one we're going to be looking at this month. I bounce back and forth between these 2 days because if one falls on the weekend or a holiday or a commitment I have, 9 out of 10 times it's easy to just pick that other day. This month is going to be on the 25th because 420, of course, is a holiday. And with these things, I haven't been able to go live on YouTube like I was in the beginning. I don't know exactly why. I think it might be copyright strikes. It just doesn't seem to work. So instead of hundreds of people that I had, we're only getting dozens. And then only 3 or 4 or 5 people want to actually talk. So I would love to see more people who want to talk on the show show up and maybe even have something prepared to say, an experience that you had, a theory that you have. You know, it's a time to put your ideas and your experiences up on the main stage. At least that's what I like about it. So be there April 25th, 7 p.m. Pacific time. You will find the links a few hours before all over the place. Facebook, Twitter, Patreon, and the Plus site. Also, I've mentioned this before, but it is really happening now. So I'm going to start talking about it at the end of every show, just so I know we all get the message. But the Higherside ecosystem is being redesigned, upgraded, we should say. We're combining the free and plus sites, making the archives less segmented, and I am adamant with the developers that I don't want to disrupt the listener's connection to either the plus or the free RSS feed. But when you're trying to bring 2 websites together, I don't know how reasonable that really is. I think these are talented guys. I've seen the design mock-ups, and I'm really impressed. I'm actually quite enthusiastic. But I just want to put it out there so that you're aware that if, in say, 4 to 6 weeks from now, your feed stops updating, let's say, even if we install a redirect, you might have to do something quite simple, like just refresh the thing. I don't know exactly what to expect, but it's good to communicate with you now rather than later if you happen to have issues getting the show, because you wouldn't be hearing me then. And I'll spare you all the reasons why I'm doing it, but there are good ones, from being at risk of a delisting by Google to less confusion over the segmented show archive to the fact that I plan on doing this for the rest of my life. So let's make it right for the long term. Maybe I won't spare you the reasons why, but anyway, as you know, there's always a plus portion to the interviews I do, an extra hour for those who support the show with a plus subscription. And this one with Jay Dyer is no different. And in it, we talked about a little more of my Gnosticism versus Orthodox Christianity questions. Of course, that's a natural continuation of the V for Vendetta discussion. But we also talked about MK Ultra in media, things like Stranger Things, inversions of norms in media, aliens as rebranded demons. You know I love that. And what I really loved talking to Jay about was his globalist book analysis series that he does for his paid subscribers. And that's where he talked about Jonas Salk's own writings on vaccines and their uses, which ties into our last show with Del Bigtree. And we had a lot of tie-ins today. Even KJ Osborne got a mention. And that's fun when that happens, pretty organically, right? And we also talked about geoengineering and weather weapons spin and film, another great section from his book. I think that second hour has a lot of interesting stuff in it. And again, guys, I do really like both Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2. Jay's books are great reads. I am thankful to him for sending me the set and signing them both. Great additions to the Higherside bookshelf. And sometimes I sit and think, man, I have a really great collection of signed books from great authors that I've interviewed. Maybe they're my peers, I guess, but they're talented guys, and I'm lucky to know them and be involved in any way. I got the best job in the world. But that's the show. I hope you enjoyed it. We do it all for you, and of course ourselves. But I am very thankful for everyone hearing this, and I hope you keep coming back. I'm getting out of here. Your move, Hollywood wizards, culture creation occultists, and makers of that sweet, sweet 8mm magic. Your fucking move.